Okay, I hope I cover everything because I made a recording which I'm not going to upload, which is probably a bit too sort of rough and experimental almost. But uh, yeah, I hope I sort of retrace all of that content and this sort of continues on from the last recording, which I think I will probably in some details I might deviate a bit anyway. So basically, I guess I'm describing borderline as being like a covert narcissist in some elaborate sense, that essentially they have a very sophisticated single algorithmic kind of strategy which um, which is quite different from narcissism, but in as much as I was comparing them and contrasting it to narcissism. Yeah, okay. Anyway, and well, the kind of covertness is extreme. Like it's not. Yeah, I guess so. I'm going to talk about borderline almost as if it is a very specialized case of covert narcissism that is constantly locked into this very particular kind of. Yeah, sorry, I'm just really surveying how difficult it is. I mean, to continue this analogy between it and covert narcissism, and because it is such a special case in itself. Uh, it's interesting. So, I mean, a lot of what I'm responding to is almost being slightly annoyed, which I know this is slightly unfair because Sam Bucknan is just giving these voice recordings and he's speaking off the cuff slightly as well. But when he talks about borderlines being sweet, I'm that really irks me badly because I know how fundamentally just far off base it is from the truth, as it were. And the sweetness that the borderlines are able to superficially generate, and it seems to have this emotional root within themselves, but that whole emotional thing, I'm basically saying that is an emulated mirage, that is a chameleon, and that mirage is even fundamentally it's not real, it's not genuine, it's not the actual core of the genuine person. That is the outer shell of the core which you never see, which is fundamentally covert. Now, the chameleon itself, that mirage sort of layer, is fundamentally unable to persist in any coherent fashion. It will fall on its sword, it will be deranged, and that is almost the vector of extracting a kind of gradient scale of increasing sympathy extraction and dependency. And anyway, the best way of actually understanding borderline overall is to it's best characterized by triangulation. Triangulation, I know, has a very particular meaning. I would actually like to start using it generically and abstractly to include, because almost everything that the borderline that characterizes the core of the borderline structure is triangulation. So if you can sort of take the scenario of triangulation, but generalize that abstractly into, and then you can start to read what the behavior is actually accomplishing of the borderline. So obviously triangulation generally refers, I don't actually know if it has a generic meaning in the borderline case, but generally it's to do with romantic partners, or at least that's how I saw Sam Buckman speaking of it. But triangulation, I think, is actually the overarching modus operandi of the borderline, as applying to everything. Uh, and this is actually what causes the borderline to have a dysregulated identity to a large extent, is because of its fixation on having of having let's say a modus operandi which is utilizing triangulation, because it's such okay. So let me just talk about the prerequisites that are required. So the kind of subtextual triangulation, which I think is constantly occurring, is to do with the control that the borderline is the inner child of the borderline, which is the demon playing chess behind everything that you don't ever get access to, that it's not really that's never visible, that makes itself completely invulnerable. That demon playing chess that you never get to, that never makes itself vulnerable. That demon playing chess wants to be able to use tactical strategic maneuvers. And one of the best moves in chess, it's a good analogy, is forking. When you use the knight to fork, because the knight can cover many different blocks at the same time. The knight can claim many different places. It can go forwards, backwards, laterally. So the knight is the most versatile piece on the board and the most strategic piece on the board, and that is almost archetypally what the borderline wants to be able to do. Now, the problem is that life itself is complicated. It's complex. It's a complex system. So it's very hard to actually rely on strategy, because you would have to update your strategy, and they never update their strategy. I'm making the claim that all they do is triangulation, subtextually, and so the only way to make triangulation work is if the world revolves around you, and if reality revolves around your judgment of it. So the demon playing chess is such a judgmental creature. It is something that has this unilateral access and power to narrate what the true description of reality is. That's what it sort of gives to itself. It's a kind of solipsistic kind of chess playing demon, and because it gives itself a unilateral position of being able to do this and arbitrate over that. When you're actually playing social games, when you're actually in the world, as it were, it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. You're going to sort of, practically, you're going to run into problems, as it were. Now, the solution that the borderline has found, and perhaps this inclination is generated from growing up or whatever, is to associate with a narcissist, or to find someone who is playing in a formulaic way, like the narcissist is, claiming to be in control of everything, or claiming to know enough about everything, that they have a hand in everything, or something like that, to have some kind of ubiquity, to have some feature or value that is representative of something that is ubiquitous, and that creates an alignment, a general grid, a general matrix that can be that represents a supreme value. And this is very similar to all the things that I was talking about when I was talking about the archetypes in scripture that talk about the kings and the rich merchants that the whore of Babylon is consorting with, essentially, that are drunk on the wrath from the fornication with the whore. So the borderline is just looking for one of these people, one of these kings or rich men or something like that, that are rich in something, and that richness or that power, that wealth or that kingship in a particular thing claims to have a certain purchase over everything in an even aligned way, or something like that. That is so when I say that they want to associate with a narcissist, that's the actual aspect of the narcissist. Now, for them, they would prefer a narcissist. You see, it doesn't matter if the value that the person claims to have command through or over or upon. Yeah, so I mean, narcissist might be slightly the incorrect word. But functionally, the narcissist will do this, because the narcissist's acting, social acting, the false self of the narcissist, the game that the narcissist is playing, is fronting that control and that measure of awareness, let's just say, or something like that. But essentially, the borderline wants to associate with someone who has some kind of ubiquitous qualia in their character, because then essentially, by association with that character, the world revolves around the borderline. So if for reality to revolve around the borderline, the way to do that in life itself, essentially, is that you have to be associated or linked to someone who has that ubiquity. And it's interesting that to hear that a borderline might complain that the narcissist feels ubiquitous, and that is essentially generally created by the inconsistency and the incoherence of the identity chameleon, sort of procession of atmospheric attachment to the feeling body of the other person. Or so I do think it is still correct to call it the feeling body. That is the level at which they want to communicate their fleeting thoughts and their inconsistent or whatever, because that is how they're subtextually controlling and getting the other person to administer and take responsibility. You see, for them to be pandered to, they want to be pandered to by a narcissist, because the narcissist, the formulaic game that the narcissist is playing, is that they have some great grand command or something like that. So therefore, relative to the game that the borderline is playing, they can trick the narcissist into burdening all the work. It's not the work. It's the work that fundamentally comes from the unaccountability of the borderline. So essentially, the borderline doesn't want to take accountability for the outcome and the effects. They want to be able to gamble, but not accrue any of the losses, and just change the game always whenever there's a loss, and keep whatever winnings have happened in the prior incarnation. So as they change the game, they continually add the descriptive mass of what's going on, and they continually draw on it as a resource to leverage and use, as they continually make up new chameleon identities for themselves or whatever. So anyway, the whole point is that if they can see themselves as being associated with someone who has a ubiquitous reach and purchase on reality, then it's ostensibly, or not ostensibly, but functionally, reality can revolve around them. It's the most important thing, that essentially reality revolves around them, or they must become the center of the universe, because then triangulation is always valid. Then you can do splitting, you see, because I think splitting is actually a long game, is a subtextual long game of triangulation. See, like when you're splitting, you're creating a lot of chaos, you're creating a lot of inconsistency in the short term, and in the long term, well, somebody else has to sort of administer it for you. Someone else has to manage the incoherence and the inconsistency. So, and essentially the point of the splitting is that in the short term, essentially what was just being leveraged was like a kind of a direct prompting, a direct prodding, a direct coercive manipulation or whatever. So it's just this procession of wanting the feelings pandered to in the immediate instant, because the control is what is prized. And then if they get their control ostensibly frustrated in the immediate, it's creating enough general incoherence that eventually the idea is that, well, that creates a descriptive mass of incoherence which they can get somebody else to manage, or somebody else to father in the future, or something like that, or somebody else to adopt, actually is the better word. It's the idea of trying to find someone who will adopt this bundle of inconsistent and incoherent expectations and ideas of entitlement and fleeting thoughts and different, perhaps incommensurate desires that can't even be satisfied because they are self-contradictory, but somebody else will have to do the work of giving them a stable histrionic sort of, like the idea that somebody will eventually bribe them or beg them to have a stable vessel of receiving something. That's the kind of metadrama that they want to get into, because that would be another example of their ultimate control and ultimate center of the universeness. Essentially, that's almost the conceptual end of the road, as it were, of their strategy. Because the only thing that is consistent and that is conserved in their thing is their obsession, their singular obsession with being the center of control, the only thing that causes anything else, and that everything else must be a reaction to them. And that is exactly what they actually end up engineering, even at tremendous, if they can get someone to repeat themselves, if they can get someone to, that idea that they can extract via this contrived sympathy of depending on this like greater narrative, that they can, because essentially that's what they are doing, they're tracking the narrative, and therefore they can know exactly how much blood that they can sort of squeeze out of the stone. So I mean, that is like what's actually going on underneath it all. It's like, at some level, chess becomes, you can make a tree as to every possible move in every possible game. Like it is actually not an indefinite problem, and that's how they have sort of gamed reality. But they require a partner in crime. They require someone who can fulfill the role of burdening some aspect of matrix ubiquity or something like that, in terms of aligning everything that they can then use as their puppets, and they are the kind of the covert puppet master. So you can almost see it as a kind of vicarious narcissism, I would say as well. And that vicarious narcissism seems almost covert on their part. Now, I can understand calling them, they're actually quite sweet or something like that. You have to understand that sweetness, the reason why I'm irked by people describing them that way so much is because if you concede that to them, there's no hope for them ever actually recovering. They're never going to get any better whatsoever. It's going to be absolutely impossible, because you're buying into the act, as it were. You're buying into the mirage. And what you have to understand is that internal drama is that supposed internal drama that they have, this idea that they have, that they feel bad, they actually do feel guilt. The chameleon mirage shell version of themselves pretends to feel guilt, but that whole thing is literally a facade, and that facade is literally just the ongoing procession of this process. But what you have to understand is that if, in fact, it's there to look like it is giving some kind of some kind of empathy, because that empathy is the seed of future sympathy that they can extract as well. But to humanize that part of them, essentially, you have to understand that it's like you're looking at someone who has a glass house, and they've placed this glass house in the middle of a busy street, in the middle of a built-up town in the high street, and their house is on the corner of a high street, and it's just completely glass. Everyone can peer into it. And they have this internal argument between the architect and the secretary that live together or whatever. And you can even hear through the house, and everyone walking by on the outside, they can see the internal arguments. They can see the internal chaos. They can see people throwing plates at each other, and food, like a food fight or whatever, and they're doing this in a public display. They're, in a sense, they've showcased themselves, and people perhaps are gawking that, because it's almost pornographic. It's the function of this. Uh, the function of this exhibitionism, and it must be regarded as exhibitionism. That's why it irks me so much. Is because if they can be sympathized with, if this drama can be validated, this supposed internal turmoil and drama is validated, it's just a license to continue, because it is exactly that secretary facility that needs to be completely broken down and dismantled. That is the ongoing process of the never-ending, that is like the first time that they send the envelope. The envelope is has to have more good than bad in it. Because it has to try and forge a kind of idea of reciprocity or a quid pro quo. Or it's actually quite funny because anyway, this has to do with essentially it's weird. I mean, I think that almost in principle what they do is the reason why they seem to be so nice or whatever. They pretend to be amenable and pliable is because essentially that is the role that they want you to take. That is the kind of self-sacrifice that they want to extract from you. And so they kind of have this like basic emotional logic that if they are nice to you in this way and then you relate to them on that basis, then they have the right to reverse the flow. And so essentially they are just being nice and conciliatory in the beginning stages, essentially. But it's just part of the gradient scale, essentially. That's the vector of escalating decompartmentalization, which they do which the secretary does by crafting these envelopes and opening them in a gradient scale and shuffling them around and sorting them and having them calibrated. And that same secretary is the one that you're empathizing with. That same secretary is the one that seems sweet every now and again. Has a kind of, because sometimes the secretary goes on vacation and then comes back and then they're nice for a week or something like that. It's like. But then the more you give into it, the more you reify the secretary role, and the more you accept the secretary role, or the more reality that you cede over to it. It's it can't help but because it's there to hand out a gradient scale of envelopes. And so when you're talking about its sweetness, you're just talking about the nicest end of the spectrum of their gradient scale of their long con game, because they know that they're vulnerable at the start. They need to set up the attachment so that they can start their triangulation really functioning. And again, I'm trying to abstract the process of triangulation, that essentially it's all a giant triangulation. And if you plot it like that, I understand I probably haven't explained it the best, but if you plot it out like that, I think I've probably described it enough that you can sort of see all the pieces of the puzzle. Now, I wanted to talk about myself again. Now, you see, this is, I can't remember if I only spoke about myself in the last recording, which I'm not going to upload, or if I did talk about myself in the last one. But I was trying to, in the last recording, which I won't upload, but I think in the recording that I did upload, I did talk about myself. I wanted to neaten up what I said about myself, because I think I was being slightly a bit too, I was just labeling it and I didn't describe it properly. And I think I described myself as as being a kind of pseudo covert narcissist, and I mean something very specific by that. So having endured abuse from a borderline, or I found a coping strategy for myself, or a survival strategy, which I still have to use, um, is what I would call self-triangulation. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because it actually, this concept that I'm going to speak about has huge ramifications for understanding sociology to some degree, and culture to a larger degree, and the influence that certain psychological factors have had in creating cultural conventions. And I'm going to lead from this into talking about gender politics. So the only way to protect yourself from a borderline's influence is to, what I would call, do something like self-triangulate. And because you see, like, because the borderline have this escalating scale of wanting to control everything and wanting to be the cause of everything and being the only cause of everything, they have to dictate what goes on. They have to have a hand in it. Their judgment has to be the ruling factor, as it were. So if it doesn't happen according to how they expect it to happen, they will actually undermine it. They will actually seek to derail it. You know, the process of decompartmentalization is one of attrition. It's one of demoralization. It's one of disorientation. It's one of injecting chaos into people's lives. Because you have to get someone to the extent to which that they are happy to have a merged reality, as it were, to make your reality pliable to their emotional, fleeting judgment, or whatever, or what to their next mirage, which is the medium through which they get to direct the puppet strings, the subtext through the mirage, through the chameleon. But anyway, the only way to create any kind of independence and any kind of sphere of functionality that works independently of them is to, what I would call, self-triangulate. You have to preoccupy yourself with almost external factors, with extraneous concerns, and those extraneous concerns have to almost triangulate you so as to effectively make you unavailable. And you can do this to a certain degree of self-reporting, which you will be punished for, because if you self-report anything that doesn't, you can try to, you see, in some sense, like, people who I think have relationships with borderlines will realize that essentially the only way to have any kind of break, and you'll still have to pay for it, or any kind of space that is your own, is to essentially do what I'm going to call is self-triangulation, is to have extraneous factors and extraneous concerns which you have to be responsible for, which you perhaps are responsible for, and you have to attend to them. And it just so happens that means that there are certain constraints that you have, and then you can't pander to them as they so demand, or as they so feel entitled to being pandered to. And that means that you'll probably be revisited some revenge for that, for not being able to reconcile with their demon or something like that. So they will extract some kind of punishment, or they'll impose something, because you can't get away from them being the central judge. But you can functionally do things away from them, but you will have to pay some emotional price. You will have to bleed. You will have to a pound of flesh. Will be taken from you. So either way, because the game of the abstract game of triangulation that they are playing, they will always see to it that they are. But anyway, you can sort of at least make some space for yourself by having extraneous concerns or whatever, which essentially, like a Venn diagram, overlap and somewhat abduct you from having to adopt their reality and their unilateral control through their unilateral judgment on reality and things like that. and their feelings and whatever. So anyway, what's my point? Is this that self triangulation? I think has uh, is a kind of is the only slight protection or insulation that you have into actually having being immediately accountable to their incoherent procession of inconsistency. Um, I mean, and some people, obviously this is a very dysfunctional kind of pathology which forces other people to precipitate very pathological manifestations. And so it's very, these people are a social poison. They are toxic. They are toxic to the people that they are around, because they often conceal their manipulation and abuse in pretty sounding, sweet sounding, good intentions of just wanting to protect things, or just, it's often done under the aegis of security and protection and niceness, and I do think that in general, this is what has created one of the reasons why we have gender politics to a large degree, is because women in general, and this is for perhaps evolutionary reasons. I don't know if I want to go into talking about this so broadly. But when Cato the Elder was talking about women, going through all of those paragraphs, not just the ones that are commonly the bits of the paragraphs which are commonly taken out of context. Well, they're not. I mean, it is representative of what he says, but it doesn't have the full reading, the full. It doesn't have the full context, and the flow of what he's actually saying is it's actually quite badly misshapen in the parts of the paragraphs that are usually extracted of what he says. It's very interesting because I do think that as women as a generalization are accurately what Cato describes is a good generalization of, let's say, the feminine social construct, what it actually does, how it operates, and there are many good women who wouldn't, let's say, be part of that status seeking sort of cabal of using, well, this is now the norm, so this is what I expect, or something like that. That kind of just leaning on convention and depending on the stringency of this idea of conformity, or it's almost like a groupthink or whatever. But that's the kind of thing which borderline uses as its Trojan horse to conceal not being questioned, to avoid criticism, to avoid inspection and answering. I would say, I mean, you can, if you want to know what the real problem is in human relations in terms of gender politics, the whole thing is that you're not allowed to criticize women. That essentially, and this actually has a huge toxic effect on the whole of society. And it's not because of women; it's because it gets into everything. The idea, especially when you have more equality in society on some superficial levels, in that people from any gender and any biological sex or whatever can be any job or something like that. That's what I mean by superficial equality. If anyone is allowed to be anything, then you have to. It becomes problematic in terms of how do you universalize the idea of not being able to criticize women the same way that you're allowed to criticize men, because essentially that becomes especially in this idea of advancing ostensible equality, which is when I say ostensible equality, I mean the kind of the fake equality being spoken about by feminists, which is essentially society must be reordered according to some kind of feminine values that have been suppressed. It's always sort of depicted as this victim sort of narrative. But it's interesting because they don't have any clear demands. Their demands are just all based on they're all centered around the perpetrator. They don't actually have a vision as to what things should actually look like in a stable sense, and they don't describe the equality that they want. They just describe the things that they don't want. It's just all these sort of negative values, because they don't have any groundwork to any of their ideology essentially. But uh, which is its own thing, which is probably quite similar to the whole borderline thing. But let me just follow this thread here. Is that so? Therefore, if you're still not allowed to criticize women as you are allowed to criticize men, but now we want equality, so that means actually you shouldn't criticize men just as you shouldn't, in the same way that you shouldn't criticize women. Like, that is essentially what is making everyone go insane. That is because it's dysfunctional, because let's say the double standard as in terms of the ethical behavior that women exhibit essentially, or the double standard in the ethical standards that are imposed against women that are different to those imposed against men. Those double standards, how you can't criticize, and you can't. It is a form of dishonesty. There's a form of social conventional dishonesty. Now, this dishonesty, I think, has generally was created by borderline women in the first place. And it was perhaps entrenched also by men reacting to it, by having to tolerate it to some degree. Now, I mean, it's obvious why. There are three other things that I need to talk about as well that all relate to this, but they are some of them are tangential. Okay, I mean, so obviously women have intrinsic value to the group, because when we lived in tribes, generally speaking, women are a measure of success in a tribe, because the more women you have, the more your tribe can essentially grow. And numbers, roughly speaking, all other things being equal, and is going to be a measure of competitive advantage. If you're doing something right, it's going to multiply what you're doing right, having more women or having more women satisfied. And you definitely can't sort of just selectively say, no, you're too borderline, we're not going to include you in the gene pool. Like, evolutionarily, it's much worse to be a man than to be a woman. Evolutionarily, men get cut from the gene pool at twice the rate that women do. Essentially, if you're a woman, you are fundamentally valuable in human society and human culture, and probably human psychology even represents this. Just because of those sorts of evolutionary pressures or whatever. Okay, that's not even one of the tangents. That's just a factual factor as to perhaps the position that we're in. One of the tangents that I wanted to talk about is because when you look at borderline men, I almost wanted to call this video "The Secret Life of Borderlines" or something like that, because borderline men, I think, are much more interesting than borderline women, because they also reveal aspects more conspicuously about what's really going on, because borderline men actually take a lot more responsibility. They take a lot more accountability in terms of setting up certain basic conditions in order to have a stable codependency to some degree. They secretly do quite a lot of work. And they do it because they realize that they actually have to maintain the gender roles and the gender standards and the gender dichotomies that have been essentially, so essentially they will always be inferior borderlines to female borderlines, because culture is just less complementary to their style of behavior. That's a very interesting sort of tangent, and let me just move on. But it's interesting because they are capable of, anyway. It's interesting because I would say that the borderline men are almost a very interesting case, because they almost instinctually know that they are acting out a sort of feminine trope, and they actually can't then fully own their own borderline characteristic, as it were. Um, their demon playing chess knows that it has to go, it has to play second, it has to play on the other side of the board, as it were. It's like it's playing the same game, but it has to play it sort of in not what they have to invert some of the mechanics. They have to, like in chess, where you have the white side always goes first and the black side is the second to move the piece, because essentially they have to induct the movement on the other side before that they can move, and therefore they actually have to secret, and they're actually, they have to skulk about and do this, because they can't exhibit too much accountability, because then they can't they don't have because it's like the glass house thing, because they need to have that sweet empathy, they need to share that on some degree. And so essentially the male borderline, and this might not be in every male borderline case, but the male borderlines that I've got in my head, they know essentially that, I don't know how to, the analogy doesn't work so nicely. Yeah, it's too much of a mixed up analogy, but I was going to say is like, the male borderline can't just get away with having the glass house on the main street. They have to sort of frame the glass panes. They actually have to. They have to sort of. They have to actually not have a house built of glass. They have to have a house built of dark tinted window panes, so that like other people can't peer in, like obviously, or so it's, they have to disguise their exhibitionism, and so, but they have to essentially plot how they're going to perform that same kind of exhibitionism of their supposed sweetness. They have to stage their own exhibitionism of sweetness. They have to be much more diplomatic in their envelopes. Their envelopes actually have to have. It's weird. I guess you could just say that there are more histrionic threads within the male borderlines activities. That their identity, when they are having their chameleon identity being, like updated and revised, they are much more careful. They are like, you can imagine Dr. Frankenstein making his monster, stitching it. They are stitching up the pieces of that new chameleon identity. They are doing it. They're scientists when they do that, and it's actually much more conspicuous. Their science is much more conspicuous, whereas the female narcissist doesn't have to be technically proficient when they are moving from the one to the other. They can just slop together any Frankenstein's monster. Because the more chaos, that the more inconsistency and incoherence, the more that they can just say, oh, I don't understand anything. Oh, I'm just a sweet little bunny rabbit or something like that. It's okay. Okay, let me go back to the gender politics. Now, the reason why I talk about this is because essentially then I do think that gender politics, to a large degree, I mean, look, there are also basic biological facts which mean that there are certain asymmetries within gender politics. So maybe I should just talk about that to try. I mean, I understand that, who wants to listen to a crackpot talking about, evolutionary psychology. But let me just survey what I think all the relevant sort of facts are before I talk about the psychological thing. So one of the basic relevant facts is the basic asymmetry in male and female sexual selection strategy. There are different competitive strategies for sexual success. women, I mean, obviously women need to be protected, they need to be provided for to some degree, from an evolutionary standpoint, in order to have children, because they're very vulnerable with young children. They need somebody else to help do work and things like that, to assist them in that role. So what's my point of saying this? Basically, I think almost the heuristic that, because I mean, you can't just talk about basic biological facts, because the biological facts inform, let's say, the cultural strategy, or the psychological schematic strategy, which then have a reverse feedback effect. So you get the chicken egg sort of thing, which one happened first. But I think almost a good generalization heuristic of understanding female behavior within culture is that essentially women always have to act 5 years older than they are in terms of the responsibility that they outlay. No, I've actually said it incorrectly, but essentially they feel the pressure of acting more responsibly than their biological age relative to men. So essentially, an 18-year-old woman is like a 23-year-old man in terms of the decision, the feeling of responsibility that they perhaps feel for the choices that they make and what they're missing out on, the opportunity costs and such. And so because of that, it creates paradoxes in terms of the actual way that it's operated. So you get women who I would consider to be ultra feminine are the ones that are, actually more adventurous and more forthright and are more active in participating in things, because they actually ask questions and they actually are curious and they are actually making their own way to some degree. They're navigating themselves. And then you get, let's say, the lazy strategy of acting more responsibly, which is like the lowest common denominator, which is just see what everyone else thinks and does and sort of just expect the same, and get an older man that's more established to just live under his wing or something like that. So it's the idea that essentially, well, if I feel the pressure to be more responsible, then I need to find somebody else who can be responsible for me. That's the kind of hypogamous, easy access answer to success, to at least sexual success, from an evolutionary point of view. So, and then you add this to the idea that like women are fundamentally valuable to the group in having a pro-social effect and being able to promote the numbers of any group, which is a competitive advantage against other groups, means that culture wants to make room for women, wants to have them happy, at least so that they can function in increasing the number of the group. And we probably have cultural norms that roughly reflect this. Anyway, my point of saying this is that so because women have to act or feel the pressure to act more responsibly than their actual age, this paradoxically means that they can avoid actually developing maturity and responsibility, and just find somebody else who can anticipate and pander to them and sort of make life convenient and easy for them. So, there's that kind of gender asymmetry where generally women are always going to want, generally speaking, men that are older than them because they already have established social status, which can almost heuristically equate to access to being provided for and security, and wealth and convenience. So essentially they can just chase status symbols. They can just chase, these things are what can matter to them. And they can just group source that. They don't have to even make their own judgment on that. They can just sort of use popularity. This is why I think popularity is such a big thing. It comes, it's because that is how women perceive a lot of, that's the lowest common denominator within women's measure of things, because they are not directly participating so much, and there's also a biological reason for that, um, or at least historically there has been, um, at least why they would participate less. Okay, so what's my point is that then you can see things like triangulation and borderline being being at place with what all the factors that I've described, all the cold-hearted factors that I've just laid out. You can see how borderline has a place there, how it can just sort of algorithmically look at these factors and just sort of maneuver from that position and find room there. Now, I think the way that it gets entrenched though is also by men coping with it, and men cope with it by some form of self triangulation, which creates conventions, which creates old boys clubs or whatever, which is also needed because you need to actually, if you can't specifically say no, these women are borderline, they have bad values, let's just have them not be part of the decision making processes, let's just remove them from politics, or something like that. If you don't have a culture that's capable of understanding psychology to the degree to which you can specifically suppress these values, then you can understand why you get traditional conventions of just general male chauvinism, um, just to protect from what would otherwise be a corrupting influence. I mean, it's a crude way of doing it. It's not obviously it's not just or ideal. Um, and also the self-triangulation as well can also come in the form of essentially accepting the dishonesty from the female borderlines, essentially, or coping with it to such a degree where you you allow for it. You know, oh, that's just what women are like, for instance. Women have different standards. You can't criticize women. So, you know, it's this idea that you treat women very differently. Um, and essentially, when you are doing that, you're also preserving the room for this kind of borderline thing. And so there's let's say there's a way that the triangulation and the reactive self triangulation, I think, has bred cultural norms and standards and stereotypes and whatever you want to call it, and stricture and things like that. And what was I going to say about the dishonesty that this creates? Oh yeah, I mean, and this is problematic because this is what equality, real equality, should have broken down, and it was actually breaking it down in the 90s. But then we had this huge resurgence from identity politics because it's so disgustingly premised. And I think women almost knew that they didn't like entering real equality. They wanted to keep their female privilege. They wanted to keep their borderline use of sexuality to exploit male energy, essentially. Um, and there are perhaps even some sympathetic reasons that we can have that because women biologically are still, generally speaking, that's still how they function. That's how they were. That's how our species has worked. Our species has asymmetries within it. But it is something that we do have to address as a collective, as it were, on the level of culture. And we do have to work out, are we going to go back to, or are we going to be happy with some kind of enlightened and open traditionalism where we also have some women who are, let's say, self-aware enough of saying, actually, I actually want something more equal, and some women who are responsible enough to know about themselves that they actually don't want something more equal, rather than this stupid position where women claim to care about equality, but they have the most toxic, self-deluded, broken perception of reality, where essentially they just give some historical description to substitute for their never-ending procession of expectations and sense of entitlement, um, while they just, rattle on about the most sort of convoluted and inconsistent. I mean, it's weird how non sequitur their claims even are. Essentially, the only way it even works is if you believe that the whole thing is a system, and everything is a part of the system. You can see also how their ideology works as the uh, as the borderline needs to be codependent with someone who has an alignment over everything. The feminist is, I think, in a species of this kind of borderline, just using ideology to function in the same way, to function there, as I've described it at the start, a kind of vicarious covert narcissism, through the medium of this chameleon mirage of always just, well, look at me, I deserve this because I'm a representative of any and every woman who deserves something. It's this weird kind of identity dysregulation, where identity is abstracted into this amorphous sort of thing, that just fits whatever the feeling, the current feeling is, the current feeling that also needs to be pandered to and needs to be the basis of controlling and coercing people around them. Anyway. Okay, so I was trying to make a different point. So let me go back to that. So I was just talking about like how this kind of borderline stuff, I do think, is the mother of many toxic social conventions that then just become cultural artifacts and residue, and they build up within how things function. And they do need to be, responsibly surveyed, and they can't just be thrown away carelessly, because we have to see what functions they did actually perform. A lot of these toxic things, they do have some factual substrate to them, like biological asymmetry. Like the idea also, I mean, for example, men don't really suffer from having children at a later age. In fact, one could argue that if they have children at a later age and they're more established and they have more wealth and they've been more responsible, that they can actually sort of perhaps be better fathers. I mean, but essentially, men aren't generally penalized that much for having children at an older age. But the age of a woman having children perhaps has a quite a significant bearing on the health of children. Just, I mean, I'm speaking statistically and generally, but I mean, when you're talking evolutionary perspective, these sorts of things start to matter. Biology is something that does need to be conserved or thought about to some degree. Anyway, what's my point about? But just talking about, there are basic fundamental asymmetries. Okay, I think I've plodded through all these things. Okay, let me just go back to the triangulation thing. So, I mean, I think even to a large extent, I mean, you can say that cultural norms and social constructs, to a large degree, they all are just relics of these sorts of triangulation to some degree. Because you can sort of abstract these things into certain levels of ideology. And I don't think that they need to be thrown away entirely. They need to be transcended, but that doesn't mean actually deleting them necessarily, because conventions can be very useful. They're a very good starting position. Even if you don't like the starting position, it gives you a model from which to negotiate, a model from which to what's the word, novate and innovate in a specific negotiation between specific people that are individuals. So, individuals don't have to be afraid of conventions, and trying to get the perfect conventions is itself a very toxic enterprise, because that essentially is being Machiavellian and manipulative on a meta scale. The way that you actually empower people is you make them uh, aware of these things so that they can be cognizant of them in their own in their own personal contracts. And I mean contracts in a broad sense, like how you use your own communication, how you use your own words, how you agree with people, what you do, and talking esoterically about abstract things going on. I mean, is such a waste of time. Talking hypothetically and talking generally. I mean, generalizations. You know, I mean, I'm not afraid to talk about generalizations because I don't think that they matter to individuals. They might matter generally to a group of individuals to some statistical degree, but that's neither there nor here. That's not ethically burdensome. And trying to work out how accurate something has to be before you're allowed to say it or not. I mean, well, that's something that an authoritarian, dictator maybe thinks about. It's completely hypothetical, and it's not worth thinking about, because that is not how society. Well, I mean, I guess it depends if you're a real classical liberal or not, or if you actually are a fascist at heart, essentially, which these social justice warriors very clearly are, essentially borderline personality disordered fascists. I mean that is a duplication there. I'm saying that that there's something intrinsically similar to political philosophies like Nazi philosophy and borderline, essentially. Well, I mean, you can also relate it to some other things, but because essentially, I mean, it's a bit abstract, but you understand that, for example, the idea that your race has a certain destiny, that the blood in the soil has a certain destiny within it. That's the kind of the chessboard and the demon playing chess. That's, I mean, it's quite concealed, but it's almost like the mythological subtext that is at the core of everything, which is not worth speaking about directly because it's basically simple, but it's like it pervades everything and it gets its hands in everything, and it has a kind of hidden hand in everything. And it's meant to be sort of like the whisper of God in the background. And that's essentially the kind of control that the borderline is orchestrating, while they are also exhibiting a kind of internal drama which they want other people to care about, so that they don't ever have to reveal what's actually going on. Yeah, so I think I tried to make the link about how triangulation leads to the like outlining conventions, which leads to kind of cultural residue. And it's interesting because I think if you listen to what Cato the Elder was saying in fully in context, and you relate it to that, you can see that he's almost talking about how it's coming from the female side. How this tendency of, let's say, cultural corruption comes from the female side. That's exactly what Cato the Elder was talking about. And then the other things that I spoke about, which was just how narcissism, the kind of formulaic false self that the narcissist is trying to play as a social game, is what the borderline is trying to plot their control against, or plot their control through being in association with it. Because if they can anger, I mean, it is exactly what's written in the scriptures when it says, the kings and the rich merchants are drunk on the wrath from fornication with the whore. That is how the manipulation is going. That is exactly how the unconscious mind is relating to its subconscious feeling body, which is essentially being I mean, this is why the borderlines will actually throw you into a contest against other values. That's why they will kind of try to get your goad. They will try to make you into one of these kings or rich merchants and try to pitch you against the other values and the other concepts of alignment. She will try to anger you by essentially giving you these different envelopes of these random things, because she's trying to decompartmentalize you and get you into sort of a feeding frenzy to compete against the other potential suitors, perhaps, or to outperform others, and to be the ubiquitous presence that then she can depend on, and she can do whatever triangulation she wants, because it'll all resolve into something that she can force you to adopt. Yeah, okay, that's everything. Let me just check my other notes. Yeah, I was going to speak about also, if you look in the Nazi, the kind of the Nazi society, that the ubiquity of the Jewish conspiracy is something that I think is useful to parallel against the ubiquity of the narcissism that the borderline is complaining against, and the ubiquity of social injustice that the social justice crowd rattle on about. These all function the same. How the Nazis complained that the Jewish conspiracy had infiltrated the minds even of the Aryans, and how the Jewish conspiracy had gone so deep. And it's the same, this idea of white, what do they call it, white thinking or something like that. They have all these very strange, the strange new language that racists always invent. Like, it's like with the KKK and their half magical bullshit. Exhibition of internal drama only occurs through a ubiquitous host that the codependency is attached with, which allows for splitting and triangulation as easy go-to forms of heuristic formulaic strategies to make those valid strategies. The only defense against them is self-triangulation of extraneous factors, which they will profusely try to ignore and disregard. Then where the hell... Oh, yeah. So you see, like, when you try to occupy yourself with extraneous factors, which perhaps are even real factors that have been imposed on you, or that cannot be, they cannot be wished away. They are actually real things that you have to attend with, real responsibilities. But because they're not judged as real enough to the borderline, then you see the real disdain and disregard, and you see, where does the sweetness go then? Then suddenly the sweetness evaporates, and it's just this corrosive, demanding, entitled wench. So and I would say that that sweetness and that supposed empathy is only the most superficial mimicry of a I was going to say that sort of supposed sweetness. It's weird. It only sort of applies. It never applies. It never truly applies abstractly to other things. They don't actually, like, they're sweet about their own apologies. They're not sweet about something bad that happens to you in some other part of your life. Like, it's never, it's like, that's a bit too far removed. That's too intellectual. It's too far removed from their own immediate interest. They will not actually follow a course of conversation or a course of a line of reasoning that doesn't pertain to an immediate goal that they have, that they're following. They don't, so like they they're not actually interested in anybody else's state of mind. They're interested in how ready that state of mind is to essentially serve them. And they are interested in that state of mind to the extent to which that they want to redirect and perhaps demoralize it and get their attention back for them, you know. They're very monopolizing, basically. So this sweetness, I think, is a superficial mimicry of faux sympathy for extraneous factors, if they ever are sympathetic because of supposed extraneous factors. It's just mimicry. And then I did want to juxtapose this against male borderlines, because male borderlines end up doing much more of this work in secret. I mean, they won't, when I say work, they also, male borderlines wouldn't want to give sympathy to people because that was too far removed from their own interest, because that would almost prove a rule, which then they would have to maybe be, you know, it would be too much work to persist with that. So I do think male borderlines, they do cross the line, but they will always cross that line. When I say cross the line, I mean they cross the line in terms of that they will break the borderline procedure. They will break the borderline gradient scale, but they'll only break it in secret, and they will do it in hiding because they don't want people to know that they could actually be more responsible than their flagrant emotional state. And I think that that's very interesting, that you get these, it's sort of like compartmentalized lucidity to some degree, but it's only in aid. It's almost like a histrionic, they have more of a kind of, so in the same way that a borderline is like a cloud, the male borderline has a kind of, I can't think of a good enough analogy, but they have like a more intelligent sort of blanket, like a there's something in that cloud that has slightly more substance than a cloud, but it's hiding in the cloud, and it doesn't you know, so there's this I can't think of an analogy. There's like a little bit of a net. There's a net hiding in the cloud, and that net can actually sort of, is completely concealed within the cloud. You can't see the net, but the net will sometimes sort of contain things a bit better and sort of facilitate some kind of, usually this is more of a histrionic thing. Like histrionics will actually create very contrived things. Borderlines, their subtext is incredibly contrived, but they will not break the chameleon. They will not break the chameleon device. They will keep on just creating more mirages. Whereas the male borderline will also create mirages non-stop, but there will be a more consistency in the, there will be a pattern in the mirage forming, which is, it's more responsible. Is all I can say. It's that net within the cloud. It has, somehow they concede that they're on the other side of the chessboard. And they are jealous of women. Male borderlines are very jealous of women, by the way. But I mean, they don't entertain it because there's no point in entertaining it to a large degree, but they are aware of that. I just thought I'd point that out. But I mean, again, I'm talking on the level of the demon playing chess, which it seems, at least from what I've heard from some of these things, it seems that most clinicians don't realize this. They don't realize that they're dealing with a chameleon valence. Anyway, so I'm again, I'm emphasizing that to a large degree. Okay, I'm going to stop this recording now. Okay, I just want to get back to what I was saying and clean up some things and elaborate some things. So I've been speaking more clumsily, but I hope that the general gist is coming through at least clearly. But So the whole glass house metaphor is simply to denote the exhibition of internal disarray and showing some kind of, the internal squabble that's happening in terms of in terms of how they seem to be suffering from their internal incoherency or their self-contradictory, with their bundle of descriptive mass, which has all these different incommensurate thoughts attached to them and all these implicit, sort of connotations and suggestions which they don't know how to internally manage. So they simply are trying to have that cloud of disarray be managed externally to them, which is essentially the codependent bond which that internal drama is facilitating, or that internal disarray which is on exhibition, and essentially getting somebody else to adopt it, essentially. I wanted to go back into some of this. When I said the phrase self-triangulation, I was using it as a metaphor in a way as well, and I'm just going to elaborate in that. So I was almost using it as an abstraction as well, or as a general mode, because I was also using it to describe how perhaps social norms or social constructs or are created essentially through self-triangulation, which is itself a very rough and sloppy term that I'm just sort of using, which I use. Let me clean it up now. So when I say self-triangulation, I mean a kind of, it's interesting because it is fundamentally reactive. It's reactive to the triangulation which is being perpetrated. So when I say self-triangulation, I mean it's like the victim of a borderline sort of plot, or someone who is in the vicinity or the association of the borderline has to try to create implements, conventions. In fact, the best word is trope. When people talk about, like there's a story trope, it's almost like a meme that is a kind of an element of a plot arc, or is a kind of, it stands out as having a kind of currency, you know, um, you know, tropes in this sense. You can see them in terms of how buzzwords become popular, for instance, and things like that. It's almost like the actual objects or substantive contents that perhaps are swirling around currently in the zeitgeist. But anyway, and some of these tropes are perennial, and they have different visages, and they develop, and they redevelop, and they re-manifest as new forms, seemingly. And that is part of, let's say, the great play of, as the wheel turns between the four ages, the kind of that psychosocial sort of cyclical. The four ages that have been described. I can't remember who wrote a book about it, but it comes from the Enuma Elish, actually. It comes from a Babylonian text where it was originally described. Anyway, the Vedic texts also have descriptions of these ages as well, but I think actually it's the psychological component. There are descriptions in the Vedic text, but the psychological explanation of it is more is actually more delineated in the Babylonian text, which anyway, it's got a very fancy translated title that means something like the art of civilization or society or something like that, or the something quite profound. But anyway, so it's like the book of I can't remember. Anyway, oh yeah, that's anyway, that makes me sound like a crackpot, but um, so I mean these objects, I think, are the basis of having a kind of a fluid culture that is currently digesting something. Obviously, culture starts becoming quite abnormal once you have this kind of growing propensity towards this. When the cultural hegemon becomes this kind of borderline style, um, you can see how things start. Reality itself gets contorted. Generally things get quite deranged. Academics, are almost the height of contagion. Um, they are almost the vector of this spreading social pollution. And you can see that what becomes in vogue is a kind of positivistic interpretation of legal theory, a positivistic moral um, uh, uh, structures and moral codes. Everything gets pinned into a kind of anyway. Okay, I'm talking too broadly now when I want to where I need to describe how this is actually happening on a psychological level, and how essentially it relates to these tropes. But yeah, it is interesting how borderline, at least how I've described. I mean, fascism has been described as psychological things before. Luigi Zoja spoke about the socially successful paranoid as the kind of anyway. I'm not going to get too much into his thesis, but okay, let me just show how it's interesting, because I do think that the political ideology can be a vector of inculcating a kind of borderline self-identity and a borderline mode of operating, um, which has obviously happened, for example, with identity politics. So you have this because the identity itself is like the mirage chameleon layer. It can be whatever you need it to be. It can just fill in for some lowest common denominator, and you can use it as a shield, and it's this nebulous, amorphous, sort of resource that can just be interpreted in the instant to expect other people to pander to whatever. And this all hinges essentially on the idea that there is a you see, that identity doesn't function unless it is married with the idea of systemic oppression, the idea that it's a one system, and that so it's codependent with that kind of that narcissistic power interpretation of reality and life. And so it's there's sort of the two sides of the same coin. Uh, it's just that for them, that claim, or that narcissistic thing that they're codependent with is a intellectual claim, although it's not very intellectual. It's not very I mean, you can't have an intellectual conversation with these people. It's just gainsaying. It's just begging the question. It's just that's all they do. That's all they know how to do, is sort of be hysterically amazed that anyone can even uh, uh, ever deemed to take a different you have to accept their reduction of reality. You have to accept their generalizations. They're the only one that is allowed to cherry pick, because they are the victim identity, or they are the ally or the representative of the victim identity, which they can sort of call on. And so it all hinges on, generally, the idea of systemic oppression needs to have an arch villain. It needs to have a conspiracy. It needs to have a Jewish conspiracy, or a white monopoly capital, or it's good that I can't remember their catchphrases. I guess it just shows how successful I am at sort of just avoiding them. Whatever the latest buzzword is that they're using, um, or way of constructing what it is that essentially, I mean, it will take on its own course until they very clearly have a workable way to act on it, which is essentially, it takes a long time to evolve it, we're probably somewhere in the early 1920s. Um, when did Hitler come to power? Was it like 1924? Anyway, uh, you must remember that, for example, Aryan studies was taught in high schools in Weimar, Germany, before Hitler took over. They had already taken over the intellectual establishment, because it's also easy to put prestige and credentials behind, this sentimental borderline frenzy, that takes on an intellectual visage. Anyway, so I wanted to show more how. Okay, so you can, if you take on that, let's say, that narrative of the systemic oppression and then the identity, then functionally you can act as a borderline through that ideology. And it is interesting as well because if you are borderline and you're living in a culture that doesn't have this kind of borderline rubric already built into it, that's what they will try to do. They will try to co-opt what does exist, the social conventions that do exist. They will try to just slightly make it nebulous in some places, vague in some places. I mean, this is how you essentially breed the kind of legal positivism that gets you into being able to reinterpret whatever you want onto things, and um, the plenary will of the legislator becomes the essentially it depends quite heavily on a rule of man, as it were, as opposed to the rule of law. It Everything becomes centered around the will, and then framing that will in some kind of cosmic justice, which comes from their narrative, which is needed in order to ground and dignify their the actually nebulous use of the identity, and um, having it perform and do all the things that are needed to make the ideology sort of function and viable. Okay, let me just get back to trying to ground this. So I'm just trying to show how the ideological, intellectual sort of thing is interchangeable with the psychological sort of technology that was obviously developed by some people at a very young age as a coping mechanism, or as they um, developed their personality style. Oh, I did want to say this, which I guess is slightly, well, it's not positive about borderline, but there is something. I think the reason why borderlines can be attractive to people in terms of their personality. I mean, obviously, this doesn't last because this is sort of the bait, as it were. But because borderlines are actually able to create their own identity so freely, and they almost advertise that power as in the starting opening gambit as, like, I can actually reinvent myself. It seems as if they will do it in order to be nice, or to sort of, or to pander, or they pretend that it's a facility that they have, and that they will do it for your pleasure, perhaps. That they will, the sweet and innocent, pliable, amenable, that they have that atmosphere right at the start, which then at a gradient scale quite quickly gets redirected as to, no, that's what they want from you. So they did it first, and because you accepted it, then sort of by the internal logic, now it's your turn. And essentially they were promising at the start to be so pliable that essentially the role that they were exhibiting, although they never meant to actually promise it, um, that it did have this idea that it could actually have the self-control, that they could essentially be as pliable in an infinite capacity. Like, the reason why they exhibit that is because that is what they want to extract from you. So because what they seemingly offer at the start is so unlimited, that gives them the, let's say, the rule base in their value system to extort everything from you, essentially. So essentially the kind of laissez-faire generosity that they were seemingly promising, that's what they're going to take. But why am I saying this? So the that mechanic is that mechanic exhibits a spiritual power. Sorry, uh, that okay. When I say a spiritual power, when I say spirit, I actually mean, like, I mean the core choice of a person, the core ability of a person to let's say play a game and make the game real. That's what I mean by spirit in this sense. It's like, okay, so perhaps I don't want to get into explaining this more fully, but essentially that is, let's say, it's attractive because someone who has that level of self-control, that level of being able to be that generous, to be that giving, let's just say the ability to give is on a basic level of decision and choice and will, is an attractive one, because it is a form of spiritual power. Obviously, they don't, in some sense, it's completely, that spiritual power only belongs to them and will only serve them, their chess playing demon, and they just exhibit it. They just pretend to exhibit it because that's what they want somebody else to provide to them. Essentially, they need somebody else to be strong and ubiquitous in that way, to supplement their inability to adopt their own outcomes and their own behavior and their own actions. They want somebody else to be on the hook, to be responsible and accountable for them. So it's much easier for them to try to find a strong person by pretending to be that generous of spirit, and or having the power of being that generous of spirit, because that's the kind of megalomaniacal force that they are seeking to be codependent with. Um, but sorry, okay. The reason why I bring this up, which is a kind of a tangential point, but it's just a point of description, is that this is a native power that people have innately within their psyche. Obviously, it relates to the unconscious mind, the inner child, which, depending on how integrated you are in terms of your unconscious side of the mind, you have that power to be that generous. That you can sort of, you can endure anything, you can do anything. It's a, let's say, it's a state of mind, it's a state of personal commitment to being, to having fidelity to your own decision, to have a kind of fortitude, that power of long suffering, as it were. um, so let's say they do have this long suffering, they are in fact exhibiting it, but they're actually, they're still behind their fortress walls, the borderline is, and they are merely mimicking it. They're exhibiting it as bait. That's what they're using it for. It's an incredibly maniacal, Machiavellian, sort of feat, that they are actually at the start of when they are dealing with someone, they are exhibiting this idea: I can make myself a blank slate. I can be anything. I can be anyone. And it's interesting because there is a duplicity in exhibiting that. There is an inversion that is part of a long game of subtextual triangulation. That essentially they are using themselves as the vector of triangulation. Remember, I'm trying to expand this concept of triangulation, that it's not about romantic partners. It's about, you can triangulate any scenario if you just have an immovable force. They are the immovable force. So now, if they are an immovable, if their inner child is an immovable force, they need someone who is willing to exhibit. Sorry, I've mixed up the words. They are an unmovable object. They are an immovable object. Their inner child is an immovable object. But the inner child, sorry, did I say? Yeah, no, inner child is the phrase that I use. Okay, so their inner child is an immovable object, but it resides in the unconscious side of the mind. So that unmovable object doesn't want to make itself vulnerable. It wants to remain unmovable. It doesn't ever want to change. It doesn't ever want to have external values that vest its values outside of its set of beliefs. So it just keeps on stacking up this descriptive bundle of descriptive mass, and it doesn't want to actually curate it responsibly and consistently. It doesn't have that. It's not interested in applying that resource from within the unconscious side of the mind. So instead, it needs to create this elaborate pretense and a procession of drama and whatever chaos ensues or whatever. That's just the medium. What they're looking for is an unstoppable force in terms of an emotional body, which they're not willing to underwrite. They want an external emotional body to guarantee their emotional body, because they don't ever want to have their unstoppable, immovable object in a child challenged to have to ever do anything. So their inner child is, let's say, frozen in the same way that the narcissistic persona is somewhat also frozen, but it's the narcissistic inner child is actually the doer, is actually the actor. It is actively engaging in the pretense of its emotional body. It's the narcissist has a fake emotional body, and the inner child is constantly having to directly architect it and deploy it, whereas the borderline does not have has a lazy inner child, doesn't want to ever think or do or whatever. So it creates this, let's say, formulaic, heuristic, algorithmic, mirage chameleon false self that actually is doing everything for the inner child, on behest of the inner child, to allow the inner child to stay frozen, as it were. And until the inner child actually starts, and when it voices itself, it's very direct, it's very, as I've described it before, it's actually quite corrosive, it's actually quite mean, it's actually quite blunt. It's just basically lazy. It's just a stone. It doesn't want to do anything. So like when you are talking to it, that's the actual person. They're just stuck. They're in a rut essentially, and will they decide to do anything different? Will they decide to evolve and mature or whatever? Well, why would they? I mean, they have to have an external motivation, and if you tried to describe to them an external motivation, the chameleon would just essentially use that descriptive mass to continue the charade. So the stone is the real them, as it were, and the sweet, pliable thing, that's just an algorithm there to sort of ensnare a feeling body, and they want something that is a ubiquitous feeling body, a powerful feeling body, something that has a formula attached to it, or that has some kind of principled integrity, because a principle is like a rule. It can be gamed, and so they just need someone who has a kind of consistency within their feeling body. Mostly narcissists are consistent in their feeling body because it's the whole thing is a contrived formulaic, sort of thing based on their internal weaknesses, as it were. So the borderline is very easy, capable of outgaming it, because the borderline, their inner child is so lazy, it doesn't care about consistency, so they can just continue their chaos forever. It doesn't matter to them. Um, Whereas the narcissist actually wants the ducks to be in a row on some level, and although that they're trying to, okay, anyway, uh, what was I saying here? So the main thing that I was trying to set up in a contrast is the difference in feeling bodies. That the borderline's feeling body is a I mean, they largely don't have a feeling body, but they have that chameleon thing, which is not actually the feeling body, but it pretends to be a feeling body, I guess. But that is the cloud that atmospherically engulfs the host. I'm just trying to think. Why was I talking about this? I started off by talking about essentially how the quality to be able to set your own game, as it were, being spiritually powerful sort of quality, as it were, or the exhibition of real power. And then I was just trying to say how it's weird that the borderline is making use of this power, but they are doing it for such a monotonous, self-insulating um, thing. Essentially, they don't want to engage in the world in any kind of way that would force their inner child to change anything, to think. So it's like they have completely frozen, and they are just doing this behavior instead. They are just doing this uh, these tactics, because then the inner child doesn't ever have to um, uh, make a decision, or make or sort of feel itself or something like that, or have to curate itself or anything like that. So it's got like a level of it is just completely, it's almost like a kind of ongoing suicide to some, well, in terms of it's interesting. I mean, it's hard to describe the dichotomy between the chameleon mirage and the inner child, because as I've described before, that the chameleon is like it's slave of the inner child. I've also described it as the secretary of the architect, but the architect is on holiday. The architect is vacant, um, and the secretary is sort of trying to mimic the credentials of the architect and try to cover it up or whatever. But and sort of, but the secretary is lying. The secretary is always saying, "Oh no, the architect can't come to the phone. He's in the other room," but he's not in the other room. He's on holiday. So it's like the secretary is part of the of covering for the inner child. So it's complete bad faith, um, in terms of its I mean, essentially to depict how any kind of therapy or feel. I mean, I'm not talking about in terms of how this would happen, but in terms of what has to happen. You as a stranger are coming out off the street and talking to the secretary, and you have to fire the secretary. If you're coming from the outside, you have to say, look, I'm not, you're a secretary and you should actually be fired. In fact, you are fired. And then the secretary says, but you're not my boss. And I'm like, well, when was the last time you actually spoke to your boss? I don't see your boss here. You have to sort of say, well, who's paid the rent? You know, you send these letters and these envelopes, but no one's paying the rent. You know, like you're not even here. You know, it's sort of the whole chameleon thing has to just be scrapped, as it were. But it is being implicitly. You see, this is the thing: is that the architect is not tacitly. Oh, sorry, is not the architect is not patently continuing the employment of the secretary, but he is tacitly or implicitly permitting the secretary to continue. And that omission, as it were, it must be rebuked for that omission. You must protest as if as if it was a commission, as if it was an ongoing commission. Because if it's not regarded as an ongoing commission, there is no room or capacity for the borderline to actually voice the inner child. And then when it does voice the inner child, then you have the problem is that, well, it's a fucking stone. You know, that's the problem. It wants to be motivated to do it. And as soon as you give it a description of a motivation, then it'll just hand it back to the secretary. So that's the biggest problem, is that the let's say the lack of self-motivation on behalf of the inner child. And then it's already got all this behavior set up. So why would it want to do something differently? You know, it has to choose to do it by itself. And you can't supplement that. You can't provide it for it. It has to want to do it. And, you know, you have to realize that they have been doing this for a long time. So, and, you know, there's I mean, I really believe that it's a conscious thing the whole time. It's not, this isn't like, oh, now I've heard the truth. You know, this has been an active procession of subterfuge and manipulation. They really don't want to change. Like, and this, you can talk to them on a reasonable level, and you know, at some point you can get the pretenses to shed off like snakeskin, but you know, like I don't. There's really no point in trusting them, because you know they can mimic things perfectly, and then you know they can just choose to go back to it anyway, and well, essentially that would have just been a new snakeskin, because essentially it is the abuse of that power that I was saying, to like make a game that you would make your reality. That, let's say, that spiritual power of being able to set yourself to a determination, and they have set themselves to this determination. They have decided to play this game that is potentially an unending game. They've potentially committed themselves to a game that does not end. And it is problematic, because it does create a paradox in terms of how do you come back from that. Because you can't use somebody else to come back from that. They have to do it for themselves, as it were. Okay, okay. This is a bit vague, so I'm not going to go in, because this is a nuanced sort of issue. But I mean, effectively, it's because they have been so dishonest with their own word that essentially it cannot hold trust anymore. What I'm talking about is more of a social thing in terms of repairing old things, perhaps. I mean, obviously they can turn a new leaf and actually just keep up the work of self-curatorship, of self-motivation and self-ownership and self-regulation. It's not hard to do that, but it is potentially hard to actually fix things. They can't have it all there. I mean, that's part of the realization of the ongoing work, is that you can't just set your mind to it and it will happen. You know, like they have to accept that essentially consequences. the notion of consequences, of monitoring and tracking consequences. Not being forgiven, for example, is a pretty good one, because that can sort of be almost one of the starting pieces of stone that sets up a stable reality that they are continually curating. Again, this is a bit of a nuanced topic, and I'm not going through all of the issues sort of very carefully, but sorry, let me just try to round out this issue to some degree. I mean, it's not hard for them, I think, to I mean, if they were so self-motivated to do so. What is it, to let me get to it. What is it, to yeah, I mean, I guess that's the sort of thing, is that they have to actually create a ledger of consequences that they are burdening, and to track that. I mean, that is essentially the that is essentially what characterizes. I don't want to get mixed up in the jargon too much, but that is what actually seals off your unconscious mind and makes it capable of supporting a subconscious and an ego. Because then you're using your belief system as a reference in the past tense to measure up against things that you are considering actively in the moment. That's the problem, is that essentially the borderline never became a teenager and never became an adult. They are perpetual, their inner child is just mimicking this higher order stuff. They are very juvenile. There was a thread here which was important, which I feel like I've not attended to fully. But yeah, I mean, this is what sort of characterizes the core mechanic, is that it's very, very childish. It just never, you know, that it's literally like a childhood game that you play, and then you actually realize that the game is addictive, and then you never stop doing it. And then essentially that's all you ever did, because essentially you looked like a smart child when you did it. It was a game that you did, and it made you appear to be more advanced in years. It made you look more intelligent than your peers at the time. It was just a kind of a gimmick, essentially, of mimicking maturity and mimicking sophistication. And essentially it's just prone to absorb collateral adoption, and sort of just constantly moving shifting responsibility onto exterior hosts. Um, and it's really incredibly, it seems impatient to a large degree because it's incapable of having any real considered self-referential sort of measure. Uh, it's interesting. I mean, I do think that this kind of phenomena might exist. Again, I'm not going to speculate. Um, okay, let me think. Was there anything that I skated over? Some of that was obviously very clumsy that I was describing, but so I was talking about its frozen, atrophied thing, and then this chameleon heuristic and algorithm is just sort of managing all the affairs. And I was talking about the game that doesn't end, and essentially, yeah, the game that doesn't end. Oh, about the trust, how at least people that they've abused with this heuristic and this incessant, sort of cycling, um, their power to be able to extract forgiveness in some kind of, or to get someone to assent to treating them normally again, might actually be very, someone from their past, might be quite bad because it would essentially validate to them that they have the power to incept other people and to, through their mere words and promises, be able to create identities that are validated and taken as real by other people. Um, yeah, it's. So I don't want to. I don't want to talk about this too bluntly because it's just about the issue of trust. But there is a greater issue here. But I have to sort of go through all these minor issues first before I can talk about the greater sort of overarching thing. Let me just think if there's something else I can go into. But yeah, their inability to put what they want behind the ledger of consequences that they actually work on, that they are actually committed to working within and tracking and monitoring and curating. They're just too lazy to do that. The secretary isn't capable of doing that. The secretary is only capable of sending out mirage envelopes and creating stories in the envelope. It's not the professional, it's not the architect. The architect's on holiday. Um, so, I mean, if the architect wants to come back, it's probably better that he finds new clients and goes to a new place or something like that. Because if they have to deal with the old clients, then they have to deal with all the chaos and the mess and the fake stories and all those added complications. I mean, cleaning up those things can be, depending on the people that you're dealing with, it might be useful, but it might be instructive in some greater sense. But it might also be generally disorganized, and disorganization is also one of the tools that were used so efficiently by the secretary. The disarray. Um, but yeah, the architect must. I mean, it is good for the architect to come back and to take stock of the damage that he has caused by allowing the secretary to run amok. He must adopt the responsibility that of everything that the secretary did. Can't just say, "Oh, it wasn't me. It was the algorithm that I sometimes use. It was the AI secretary, the artificial intelligence secretary." It's not good enough. There has to be vicarious liability. There has to be, because otherwise it just continues to be exported, and this endless adoption by somebody else must come in and administer it. It's just part of the cycle. It's just part of the ongoing procession. The never-ending sort of chaos juggling and triangulation. Okay, let me get back to the triangulation and the and what I call self-triangulation. I mean, yeah, see, I'm creating this vague jargon. It's a bit too bad, but so when I said self triangulation, I meant like someone who was trying to counteract the subtextual coercion and manipulation from the borderline. But I mean, technically, in some greater sense, that is what the borderline is trying to do. They are self triangulating their own social vehicle or their own identity, their own chameleon mirage procession. Uh, they are perpetrating that. And until they own that they are perpetrating that, they'll never have the lever of control to stop it. Until they recognize that and realize that and take ledger of that, it's just an ongoing shit show. Um, of excuses, of trading in excuses and trying to exteriorize blame, and which are all diversions from generating self-regulation and responsibility and self-ownership. Yeah, I was going to make more parallels with this in identity politics and other ideologies. The intellectual claims about systemic oppression and such, how that they are functionally interchangeable with this completely. And how contrived they are as well. This is a fragment, maybe I'll comment on, from Westworld, the third episode of Westworld, season 3. I really liked the other seasons. I hope this season isn't awful, because already some of the premise in the plot seems to be very, very weak. To malign a system that is using algorithms, because essentially no one will hire some guy. In the third episode, this guy isn't being hired because the computer predicts that he will likely commit suicide in 12 years' time. And so everyone who, before they hire someone, uses this program, this algorithm, to predict their aptitude or something like that, or their life outcome, the system won't let them become what they want to be, because the prediction is the current trajectory that the computer plots is negative. So no one wants to employ him, because, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, that premise, I mean, no system would ever be devised that way. It's so stupid. I mean, how would you not take into account the actual decision of the offer, or you know, like, not taking the actual thing into account, not taking the actual projected change into the algorithm. I mean, as if people don't. I mean, you know, this is a whole systemic thing, which is it actually beggars belief. I mean, that writing is at least sloppy, but almost to mirror identity politics quite disgustingly. I mean, questions have a large role to play in terms of potential development or whatever, like what question is driving you, what questions are you asking. I mean, perhaps you're asking too many questions, perhaps you're asking the wrong questions. Perhaps your problem is that you're asking the wrong questions of the wrong people, as it were. Yeah, I reflected on myself recently that I think a lot of my life is a lot worse than it could be because I'm too curious. I'm essentially, my purpose in, or the context of my activities are asking questions which essentially make me prone to other people because I'm listening for the answer. I'm making room to have other people provide me their take on it, and yeah, I guess. I mean, it's not a problem to ask questions, certainly not. But I just think I have been acting like an agnostic a bit too much. I have been too open in terms of looking for things that uh, sort of being much too uh, sporadically sensitive and open to questing for a quest, as it were, and that kind of yeah, I mean, I would describe that as a form of decadence, as a form of it's a form. I mean, you can make a sort of metaphor about it as well, perhaps, but it's a form of um, stupidity on a level of almost heuristically trying to mimic humility. It's much better to be more purposeful and direct in one's questioning and having reasons behind it. That are part of some greater context or purpose or drive or project, rather than leaving out a lot of, let's say, your potential time and energy into following after somebody else's uh, inclination. That's what I see. I seem to be giving other people play and other people space in my mind to try to plot and help them in terms of uh, where they are going with their thoughts to some degree, and let's say that constant uh, open view of questing and being an open receiver to other people's interests um, has probably damaged a lot of, or it's made me sensitive and prone in ways uh, that I think I would rather have avoided. I mean, I think that might still be an appropriate thing to do with people that one has some basis of trust with or social, but I think I offer that, let's say, that leeway. I invite it perhaps to strangers and to anyone almost, as long as they have some modicum of commensurability in terms of their interest to communicate, at least. Um, I wonder if that might be a level of, I mean, there's a kind of persistent generosity that I think I invested into as a heuristic at some point, perhaps as a way to preserve my humanity under the onslaught of the sort of borderline co-optive and coercive gradient scale of inception and such. I mean, yeah, it is interesting how I've tried to preserve some level of functioning under the certain conditions that I'm in the midst of, and try to maximize my projects, I guess. There was something else that I wanted to talk about. Talking about other. Yeah, there are a lot of very good episodes in Star Trek. The Next Generation around season 4 and season 5. That was when I was the most prolific, I think. Right after I got rid of some of the other the drama in my life. All the way up to the end. I mean, the final episode, very philosophical. Seeing it's interesting how quickly culture can turn evil. Was there anything else that I wanted to mention? I didn't even get into the tropes and the gender politics. Okay, let me just try and get into that. The tropes. So the reason why I was talking about tropes. Yeah, so when I say tropes, I mean that in the context of social conventions and rules that people follow. And essentially, the self-triangulation is a trying to create an excuse, as it were, or a shield, or some kind of boundary, or some kind of object that can be strewn across the field in order to limit the damage of, like, you could call it the borderline, or the kind of the general incoherence that is generally being promulgated by the borderline sort of tendency. Which I do think it's valid to say that in terms of, yeah, I wanted to get into this gender politics stuff. Okay, I'm going to go full into it. So, obviously there are many individual women who are very mature and capable, and they have a good mentality, and they're fine. But women as a collection, as a generalization, they quite more so have a social force as a kind of lowest common denominator, because it's interesting, the self-fulfilling prophecy thing being created by the tropes and the social constructs that have already, that sit as the cultural residue. But just tracking the ongoing, let's say, propensity and ideology, which obviously perhaps now is the worst time ever because of identity politics being so toxic. But essentially, to dismantle the patriarchy, which I mean is such a strange thing to call what is actually, because what is actually causing what women are complaining against, although what they're complaining about is the outcome, the effect. They're not complaining about the process of how it actually happens, because how it actually happens is the sisterhood. If you want to dismantle the patriarchy, if you want to actually have equality, stop acting as a sisterhood, because that is functionally exactly what becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy, is that women operate as a block, they operate as a group, and they have used that to engineer cultural power and social power and to frame everything and to control everything. I mean, this is why you can't criticize women, is because it is the first identity politics, as it were. And I do think that that has something to do with also the concentration of borderline personality disorder, is in the female side of the population. And obviously it's not the majority, but you don't need a majority to create social conventions and tropes in order to disguise their pathology and to make it unassailable. And this has created a, let's say, a self-triangulation of men in order to limit and stem the spread of that, or to limit the damage of that being able to spread to things, which is paradoxically exactly what you would need to do in order to help promote the interests of a borderline female, because if you gave it power, it would essentially destroy the whole substrate. It would destroy everything, because it's not capable of governing itself. It needs to be adopted. It needs to have its responsibility adopted by somebody else. So if you actually suppress borderline specifically, then you can have as a value, as an ethical, or if you can't really call it an ethical system, but as a moral code, and as a list of what do you call it, of precepts, or a list of tropes and conventions. It doesn't even conserve its own logic within its enumerated tropes and social conventions. They don't function as principles. Those principles are incommensurate with themselves. They're self-contradictory, and they are sort of vague and nebulous and half-finished or whatever. So what's my point? So yeah, what's the point of talking about this? So yeah, I did actually want to use self-triangulation to be much more abstract, in that it sort of it ends up creating a kind of, because it is a convention. It becomes a rule. You could say, like, girls have cooties, girls are gross, like, would be, let's say, the most basic form of that, sort of in kindergarten, even, talking about girls. which, because when children are very, very young and trying to be slightly precocious and trying to model their behavior of adults and learning about social conventions, children are confronted with culture. Their brain waves are reading large. They're getting a lot of data. They're getting a lot of pattern, and they are trying to make recognition from what's operative, and tropes and identity and things like that are very. And young girls will, not all. I mean, but well, at least when I was very young, some young girls wanted to be women. That it was almost like a cult sort of obsession with makeup and Barbies and things like that. And other girls would also play with dolls, and in order to act out human interaction and relationships and things like that, and dynamics between people. But they were actually having genuine experiences, as it were. They weren't just trying to incept themselves into this abstract ideological. Obviously, boys and girls are very different. They have very different hormones that are influencing their brains very differently. Wow. If we weren't living in such insane times, I wouldn't have to qualify that with, just read a real book about biology and about children and psychology, and everything that I'm saying is settled science. Vance Bacard, The Sexual Wilderness, read it. This is, there are huge differences between boys and girls. Like there is in a baby, in a boy baby, he has more testosterone in his blood than than a teenager going through puberty. There is more testosterone in a little male baby than there is in a 30-year-old bodybuilder, or a 25-year-old bodybuilder, or a 35-year-old bodybuilder. Children are having their brains molded by their hormones insanely, excessively, and that is going to lead to different. Anyway, and you can see this in the behavior. You can see this in the interests, and how they are different between boys and girls. But anyway, this is not a biology lecture. So, what was I talking about? The difference between boys and girls, and again, it is interesting because I think that it's coded within the gender roles to some degree, and it's coded within the constructs. And it's interesting because these are constructs which the feminists embrace in their totality. They kind of they sort of they wash away, let's say, all of the excuse of their sort of the window dressing, and they're left with the crude machinery of female privilege, which they still are obsessed with. So it's interesting that they are like borderlines without the pretense, and instead they just have this maniacal ideological intellectual claim, which is fundamentally in fact, it doesn't function at all unless you believe their narrative. Unless you just wholesale believe their narrative, and you never think a contrary thought, and you never test it, and you never think about anything critically. It's ironic because it's called feminist critical theory or something like that. It's it's the most one-sided critique that is incapable of absorbing anything that interferes with any of its gainsaid premises. It doesn't rigorously come. It has, it's all in its presumptions. Every one of its assumptions sets it up. Like if you just take away one of its assumptions, and you can't even have it. It can't prove any of its assumptions that it has to make in order to. So it all follows from its assumptions, which are all essentially intellectual borderline personality disorder. It's quite it's quite funny. Um, but this is how positivistic thinkers. I do think that there is a parallel perhaps between positivism as an intellectual, let's say, vehicle for this species of I don't of, of psychological schema, which needs to express itself politically. I mean, this also, when I was talking about the kind of trans people, that I don't think it's actually accurate to call them trans, because they're not. They're actually, they care more about political control, and they are using the ideology of identity politics to force people in their immediate vicinity and around them to put up with their vulnerable narcissism, essentially. To use other people as sounding boards, to force other people to react to them, and to use that scenario as a springboard for them to, sort of, they I think they have these fantasies of having this diatribe and standing up for the ideology, and for being a representative of their there's a lot of fantasy work that I think goes on. It's very similar to the kind of hypothetical community that you can sort of imagine the KKK has. The kind of mythology and the kind of mythologized unity and model of civilization. It's exactly that ilk of projection and such. And some people regard themselves as the vanguard, as the intelligentsia and such, and so you have that kind of, that politicized, people that are engaged in their in it's a Trojan horse, essentially, for their vector of forcing other people to put up with their judgment, to get other people to take on their judgment. It's another way of, it's a variant of triangulation in the borderline that I was talking about. It's a way to piggyback on a kind of cultural wave, or of something that's happening in the zeitgeist, to force other people to accept you as the moral enforcer, to accept you as the as a kind of as a field marshal in some kind of larger drama, which you can force other people to play their script in that larger narrative that you're projecting onto them. And it's interesting because they use a lot of these words to talk about a lot of these things, and it's it's amazing, the kind of the self-denial and the and it's very interesting as well, because the kind of the how they try to talk about these things so that no one else can talk about them. It's like they set up their own very contrived, one-sided argument that pretends to give some version of the other side, or pretends to give some account of the other side, but it's like they can't engage with it fluidly. They can't actually communicate it, or anything like that. It's just part of their diatribe to prove that supposedly they've thought about everything. So you just have to be a soundboard. Um, Hmm. I was just thinking maybe I am slightly sympathetic to some. There maybe is an intellectual variant in there, which is even something that I might even respect to some degree. I mean, perhaps I don't like their methods, but the idea essentially to disorientate everyone to the degree to which that they have to set up an independent critical system. The idea that they're going to sort of take away conventions, that they're going to just completely collapse social conventions and social constructs so that everything has to sort of be reinvented. But, these people become useful idiots for fascists, and they even celebrate the fascists as ways of demolishing supposedly the bad constructs. You see, they're evil. I think that there are some people who actually want there to be no social constructs, and that I can have perhaps some intellectual sympathy with, and then they are prepared to somewhat be terrorists to that end. I think, which is a means that I think is, they want to traumatize people and socially pressure people into giving up their social constructs, and to prove that they are okay with giving up these social constructs, they have to put up with other people's social constructs, which they find bad. But as soon as they use that measure of, let's say, sadistic testing of the proposition that people are capable of tolerating any social construct, they've created a paradox in which they've effectively just ushered in a new set of conventions that merely just displace the old ones, and the new ones are just as bad as the old ones, and essentially then you get into some kind of retributivistic thing, and then it really is fascism. But the people that are pure in the sense that they don't want any social constructs, but then they try to ostensibly even enact that. Like, how do you prove that you're not interested in any social constructs or something like that? How do you um, exhibit it becomes the question. And then these people go out of their way to just do outrageous things, and so it becomes patently nihilistic. And so this idea that you're going to sort of, I mean, in some sense I'm against social constructs, but that doesn't mean that I'm not capable of working with them, and that I believe that they should be abolished. I think that they have to be transcended, and that means actually just being neutral about them, essentially. And essentially it's very hard to be neutral about anything when somebody else is using them in a very provocative way, in a very sort of, there's a phrase, race baiting and such. These people are, I used to call these people feminist traps. The feminists that wear very tight fitting clothing and they show a lot of skin or something like that, because they're trying to provoke someone into staring at their body so that then they can cuss them out. Essentially, it's this. It's basically a form of neo-colonialization. Essentially, it's ironic because you complain, and then you create the conditions so that you can force other people to not look in places, so that you can walk down the street and have this feeling of power that everyone has to avert their gaze, otherwise you have permission essentially to verbally assault them. And you are creating this moving space where people aren't allowed to look. So it is this sort of weird sort of power play, and that can only be justified in the context of this grand narrative of essentially the tables have turned or something. Okay, now I'm rambling too much. So I wanted to talk about the gender politics stuff, and have I done that? The tropes, the conventions, the self-triangulation. Why did I want to talk about that? I mean, I haven't really talked about it in terms of how I would consider framing the stuff in terms of actually doing something about it. I've just been talking off the cuff a bit too loosely. But yeah, I mean, culture is full of tropes. It's full of these things, and in some sense, you're only responsible for how you treat them and how you deal with them and how you process them and digest them and how you respond to them, and if they resonate with you to some degree, and how you leverage them, or how you, I mean, I still don't think that you can directly leverage them. You have to get somebody else who has the same shared agreement over that thing, and that means the same thing to both of you. And essentially, then it's just a springboard for some kind of negotiation or some kind of interaction. Um, and what has currency to one person does not have currency to everyone else. And merely generalizing people into a sociological construct and saying that the sociological construct itself has power, whether it's just or unjust, is irrelevant, because the level at which it operates on is the level of the individual, not the level of the group. And talking about a fact of a group, and this being a factor that is cast upon a group or over a group, is utterly irrelevant. And making these broad appeals and these broad activisms as if you were addressing the social construct itself, I mean, it's pathetic. It's completely juvenile. It's wanting to deal with this ubiquitous power value system or whatever that everyone is supposed to be in alignment with. It's as if you're already trying to speak to the population through some kind of authoritarian representative. It really is to conjure the Führer principle that everything should be run from a centralized sort of, everyone should have the same tether to the same kind of cloud religion that everyone should be plugged into. Everyone should operate on the same thing, as if culture wasn't decentralized. It really is the idea to try to centralize culture under some kind of political auspice. It is to create a new order in which some kind of political machinery has as one of its functions to police culture and to navigate culture and to control culture and clean it as well, essentially. And so you can see that these illiberal tendencies within these people, how well it matches up with fascistic politics, and how well they want to be the field marshals of it. And then you have to have legal positivism, and you have to have moral positivistic philosophers that get on the bandwagon and dress it up as having any kind of real credentials, as it were. With the regalia of the academics, which the garb of the new priest class, as it were. And to me, it's just the same kind of substanceless mythology as the grand wizards of the grand viziers rank in the KKK. It's the same culture. Okay, now I'm just repeating myself, and I'm not covering anything new. Yeah, I think that's about it. Okay, this is going to be a new attempt at cleaning up some of these things that I'm talking about. So, again, I'm not happy with my ability to describe this somewhat abstract and generic notion that I'm trying to. I mean, because I'm talking about borderline, but I'm also talking about culture at large and ideology at large, and the connection between this psychological schema or personality style. But essentially, self-triangulation is very interesting because it bears the same hallmarks of borderline. It's like a replica because essentially that's the only way to insulate yourself from the borderline influence, is that you have to match it with something that operates functionally similarly enough that it can actually be an impediment to the borderline. And because the borderline is constantly decompartmentalizing boundaries so that it can try to create a convoluted and conflation of a kind of commodified trust and a commodification of planning and trust are very conceptually they amount to almost the same thing, the ability to apportion trust, but because they are trying to commodify trust into their descriptive mass, into their bundle of descriptive mass, and then their process of decompartmentalization, they can get someone to adopt the accountability of them having to do any planning, and then having to gauge trust, and this also allows them to circumvent the issue of trust as it pertains to them. They are somewhat above that, and their ability to sort of orchestrate this giant subtextual game which penetrates trust, and is above the level of trust, which is interesting because this somewhat relates to the this has a lot of interesting ideological parallels with the intellectual claims used to premise identity politics and things like that, about the grand system, as it were. But this issue of trust, as I said, like, it does have, let's say, it does, at least from a low resolution superficial glance at this at the outset, it looks potentially quite attractive because it has it seems to promise this potential of being able to take responsibility for itself, or being able to craft a game of trust, of being able to conserve its own game of trust. It has that sort of that look about it. But really, it has to function around a scapegoat. It needs a scapegoat in order to keep that commodification flowing of because it can't actually consistently and coherently have any kind of fidelity to a trust concept. It has to outsource that trust concept. And the only way to do that is to basically say, I don't have any responsibility, somebody else, it's too, and essentially that means that in case of the borderline, they want to exhibit their internal disarray. In case of the intellectual borderline of identity politics, for instance, they want to say essentially that the internal disarray is caused by the external perpetrator or perpetration of the system of oppression against them. So they have no accountability for their internal disarray. It's being imposed on them. It's a reflection of the injustice, and so it's this lack of internal evaluation. They have no leeway in terms of this. They almost have to stereotype their identity as being the hallmark of something that is internally substandard or something like that. It's got this weird kind of double-faced sort of thing that it has the same operating as the mirage chameleon identity that the borderline produces. Is that the problem is that if your identity is an amalgamate of some lowest common denominator, of some hypothetical, of some weird kind of stereotype that functions according to the narrative of the system, that it cannot contain the notion of trust. It cannot track the notion of trust. Trust gets thrown into this pervasive, ubiquitous, kind of conceptual thing, which just um, planning and trust get centralized under some grand narrative rubric, um, which owes them something, which owes the identity something. And I mean, you can start to see the outline of the Führer principle operating there. That the Führer is the arbiter of reality for the identity, and the caretaker and the guardian and the protector of the identity, and the identity deserves to be protected. That is the kind of the moral narrative of the moral authoritarianism, and essentially the Führer is like the ubiquitous narcissist that the borderline is associated with. But you see, like, trust becomes this hypothetical intellectual sort of thing, and it can just attach to whatever description is convenient to make that form of trust justifiable. So you've got this sort of, well, the identity will just fill in the gap, whatever the identity needs to be to make that formula and algorithm work. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, if that is how you want trust to function, then you want the state to control culture and to police culture and speech and such, in order to make that moral dogma, sort of functional and correct, or something like that. And so you end up institutionalizing this weird kind of cultural hegemony or whatever, and it becomes like a weird sort of fashion, and this fashion has a very corrosive effect in terms of legal institutions and legal operationing. So essentially, whatever legal theory you had, when you have this culture functioning, essentially the legal system just becomes positivistic, and it takes on the Napoleonic style of statecraft, where the intention of the legislature, as long as they can sort of frame it within something, um, you know, as long as they can interpret it as being, as falling under some kind of definitional thing, there is no qualitative interpretation of what the effect of the policy is. The judiciary is blind to reality. It just has to sort of measure people's intentions according to the ideological dogma, essentially. It has that same kind of hypothetical internal decompartmentalization to always provide whatever cherry-picked monitoring and evaluation of whatever, of even what is to be considered pertinent, in order to validate this ongoing borderline sort of mode of crafting reality on the fly. Sorry, I was trying to introduce this other issue here about, this is the whole idea. When I'm trying to say something positive about this, I mean, or this, I'm not trying to say something positive about borderline. I'm trying to say that there is something innately alluring about this at the superficial start, in terms of, for example, how the borderline starts off this process of trying to find someone to act as their, because essentially they're trying to treat someone as if they are capable of being responsible for everything, and that they have the capacity to be responsible for everything, and they're trying to lure such a person into doing their bidding, essentially, and into adopting their accountability. And some of those elements are actually not within that program, but within the universal, like, people should be able to take a huge amount of responsibility. It is possible for individuals to move mountains, as it were. And it is also possible to recognize that other people are capable of moving mountains. And so this creates a what do you call it, a honey trap or something like that. But no, that's not a good analogy. Anyway, I'm just trying to make a generic tangential claim here that the power of human beings to construct games. I mean, the problem essentially of the borderline is that they have this power to construct this game, but they've only done it once, and they will never change the game. And then they they need to stop being borderline essentially to play a different game. But that you can't compel someone to be self-motivated. It is possible for a borderline to stop being borderline, but you can't. There's no way to push them. I mean, at the end of the day, essentially, if they don't want to, they don't want to, and they won't. I mean, I do think that if people were in culture in general were able to see through this, were able to pick up this kind of machinery, just the awareness of it would perhaps be enough of a deterrent to some degree. Perhaps. I mean, it is such a insidious form of control and manipulation that perhaps that's not even the case. Because essentially they are using they are like, the chameleon identity is fundamentally it does succeed even if they don't get people to buy into it, as long as they can attract enough attention, as long as that they can sort of create effects around them, as long as they can sort of draw other people into the vortex, as it were. That is enough for perhaps them for the inner child of the borderline to feel empowered and in control. And I don't think that it's a question of frustration or satisfaction of the inner child that is going to be one that makes them choose a different course. As I said, there's no compulsion, that there's nothing outside that you can do that's going to make a difference. They have to choose it themselves. And that is something that is up to them. So, anyway, I wanted to get more into this idea of trust and planning. I wish I could talk about this more. More clearly. But I mean, this is why, for example, you have in identity politics these race and gender studies sorts of things, why they end up making blanket claims so quickly, and they end up essentially using the generalizations in sociology as an excuse for populating their narrative, and why they essentially allow themselves to believe that life is a reduction of sociological generalization, because that gives them the kind of factual stability, the hard lines in which that they can assert those conditions. They can describe them to people. Obviously, they don't even do this with consistency, because if they had any kind of intellectual integrity, they would perhaps just look at their own narrative tricks and see how they even function when you're talking about any group. When you're talking about men, for example, I mean, if you just looked at men in contrast to women, you would see essentially that female privilege has been the toxic corrosive effect that has destroyed equality within our culture. It's almost insane to rattle on about histories of 100 years ago and legal differences of 80 years ago or something like that. It's it's also quite blind to actually having any kind of thoughtful interpolation. It's just these sorts of these blanket extractions of descriptive mass taken out of context. Um, it's got this weird sense in which it kind of anachronistically imposes these sorts of these modern standards in a convoluted way, conflating them against you know weird descriptions of historical machinery, and then concocting this idea as if they are living through this, that their identity is living through this. So it's always this vicarious lived experience through the identity, in order to create this hypothetical commodification of trust, which then can be outsourced, and essentially they don't have to be objects of trust. They don't have to maintain planning or responsibility. It can be outsourced to the system. It can be exteriorized into something that must be adopted and orchestrated on their behalf. And essentially, the system owes them an outcome. The system owes them an effect, and so they don't have to be responsible for the process. Individual responsibility just comes in demanding a kind of a wholesale appeasement that must be given to the identity, and that the identity owns a certain piece of the pie or something like that, and thus life is completely reduced into the kind of descriptive mass that is exactly characteristic of the borderline machination. And so essentially there is no trust. This is all quite scary, because you can see, for example, how empowered certain borderline individuals are within the current culture. It's very scary, because as soon as you have this kind of cultural hegemon within a society, and then you have institutional leaders or administrators who have this kind of personality pathology, this personality disorder, and you actually have them in positions of power, it's very, very dangerous. The kind of kangaroo courts that you get, the kind of disgusting, because they're empowered by the rules themselves, the kind of travesties that occur according to this disgusting moral system, essentially, that conceals their abuse and their decompartmentalization. So, you get disgusting scenarios where any kind of, you can see that they will always try to cover themselves by creating a confusing situation to some degree, because under that confusion, then essentially their let's say their accusations will be attached. So it's very difficult for them. I can just imagine the kinds of female teachers that believe in this kind of feminist trash teaching young children and pervading a kind of moral system and trying to impose this moral code on the young. You can just imagine the kind of, it's sort of like, you can just sort of imagine how young Jewish boys and girls had to sit through Aryan studies in Weimar, Germany, and how, they would come up in front of the class and be pointed out in terms of their moral defects, perhaps, and in terms of, you can just sort of, perhaps it's not happening that conspicuously, but children are very sensitive and impressionable, and the idea that this ideology, this feminist ideology, is as in vogue as it is, you can just see that happening, that kind of undermining, that kind of and how it has essentially, that becomes the explanation that substitutes for trust and planning. People, it's interesting, in the third episode of the Westworld thing, which I've only seen up to the third episode, so I don't know if the writing perhaps improves, but to me it's an egregious travesty that, for example, in the plot, that they are talking about rebelling against a system because the system gives insight into people into predicting what their futures will be, but that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because the prediction means that companies won't hire them or something like that. So essentially, you've got supposedly you've got an AI computer that can't take into account a provisional a provisor. No, what's the word? That can't be asked a hypothetical. Essentially, it can only be asked. That can't add provisional imaginative conditions into its planning, essentially. So it can't. I mean, I would say the reason why I'm explaining this is because this is exactly how the borderlines profess to be unable to account for things and how they need to be adopted by somebody else to administer the stuff for them. But also the reason why they in the immediate can't actually do their own planning is because they don't have a thing to apply it to. They don't have a fixed identity to say, okay, well, this is what I look like, and then if I commit myself to doing something differently in this deterministic way, in this particular specific thing that I can add to my self identity, as in, like, I commit myself to doing this or that, that will lead to this, and that will have these bundles of consequences attached to it. They can't do any of that planning because they can't trust themselves, essentially. And I mean that in a technical way. And because they can't trust themselves is because they don't have a stable boundary of behavior. They don't have a catalog of a filtration system of a because they're not made. Their identity is not made up of principles. It's made up of whatever is the easy. It is an amorphous thing that will just take whatever the mold seems to be convenient. They will just always take the path of least resistance. They will mimic the lowest, barest they will just try to fill the bare minimum quota of whatever it is they need in order to pass muster of somebody else's, to appear to clear the obstacle or the hurdle that stops them from getting what they immediately want to have access or control over, or whatever. What's my point? What is my point? So I'm talking about this idea of trust and planning. Yeah, so in the same way that a borderline can't trust or plan things because because they have an identity in terms of identity politics. They don't have a particular identity. They're not interested in that. They want the chameleon myriad identity that gives them this power of being able to essentially decompartmentalize and demoralize other people and force them to take responsibility, and the responsibility that is being shirked by the adherent of identity politics, essentially. Okay, sorry, let me go back to the Westworld thing. So the AI in this Westworld thing is so stupid that it can plot the trajectories that people are already on. But if a company asks if they should hire this person, they don't put that hypothetical into the into a different composite trajectory. They don't make a composite of a new trajectory that includes if they said okay, or if they said actually it would turn out well, including the job offer. If the job offer was actually extended, they don't include that into the algorithm, um, or the hypothetical. So essentially this AI is so stupid it runs like identity politics. It doesn't actually it doesn't actually have a model that it can actually add things to. Um, it has this kind of projected fatalism or something. Uh, which means that essentially that the AI can't plan, because that's what planning includes. Planning doesn't just include moving around the deck chairs of the Titanic. It actually includes like having some integrity in terms of believing um, in some. No, I'm talking too esoterically now. It has to include knowing the value of something. Yeah, still, this is that esoteric point. It has to include um, knowing or having faith in what really works, um, or what would make a real change, or what precipitates change, or like a theory of change, or an accounting of change. You can't plan if you don't have a model of how change works, um, or what makes differences. Um, Perhaps this is a bit of a kind of a meta evaluation that the ego function essentially ends up providing to some degree, because it does require, let's say, a meta contextual sort of thing. But anyway, what's this point? Okay, there are some more basic things that I should say about trust. Yeah, so I mean, essentially, another way of putting it is that this AI computer doesn't have actually any kind of functional trust. The details of this dysfunction are probably worth, sort of surveying to some degree, because it will offer perhaps some insight into borderline in a more general conceptual way. But let me just go over some of these issues, although I'm not going to deal with them fully and clearly. But you know, this is going to get slightly convoluted, because this touches on issues which have supreme importance to psychology in general, and I'm not going to treat them. I'm not going to give a proper full primer on these issues before I just kind of. But this does relate to the core of the false ego to some degree, because or some issues that relate to the core of false ego, because I have spoken in other recordings about the prime importance of what's called the future image, or the image of the self that is put in a hypothetical future frame, um, which borderlines are, if anything, that's what characterizes them, because they have a future image. What most people do is they have this future image, which is the core of the false self, even, I would say, or to use false self slightly more generically than the way Sam Vaknin speaks of it. Um, but essentially, in most developed, mature people, the the image of the future self is, let's say, bogged down to some degree and measured against an image of the past self, and these things have to be integrated to some degree, and essentially, the future self image is still like the slave master, as it were. It's like that I think is almost like the inner child. but it has to come to grips with, let's say, a reference system of the past self, which can function independently. You don't need a future self to have a reference to a past self, and you can survey your past self. And that is essentially what the ego is also doing to some degree. Tracking with the past self, because you can create a self-knowledge, and a system of self-regulation and self-control just by monitoring the changes in your reference to your past self, which can be potentially even completely independent of this image of the future self. It's weird as well, because you could say that a certain constellation or a certain reading of the one could infer the other, or something like that. So these things can also be tricky, because the one type that I've tried to characterize could be someone could actually contact that internally or develop that internally, and it is actually an expression of the other one, but it's just being arrived at. So I mean, and perhaps that kind of inversion, or that slight paradox as well, conceptual paradox, is something like what the borderline is invested into. That they are using their image of the future self. They have this vision of a future self, and therefore they are just constructing and concocting and contriving whatever image of a referenced self will most readily support that, or most seemingly support that. And if they do it in such a way and add some other tactics peppered onto that, it essentially means that, well, if that gambit doesn't work, then they can pin it on somebody else. They can pin it on an exterior source that they made them deluded into doing the wrong thing. So they are never wrong, but I still think that the never wrong thing is more symbolic of the internal invulnerable control, and everything else is just a kind of is a complete set of heuristics in order to never have to have a so I would say that, like, the borderline has this frozen, pristine sense of when I say frozen, and pristine, I mean that it's perfect, but it's also perfect in that it doesn't ever want to change or move or change its values, and it's completely self-interested, and so it's an immovable object. The inner child of the borderline is just an immovable object, and therefore it naturally needs to gravitate in terms of its strategic tactical deployment. It needs to associate with an unstoppable force that can shelter it, and it can use that unstoppable force as a reflection of its pristine immovableness. So that's the kind of the formula of its codependency, because as long as it has within its narrative mass, it is associated with an unstoppable force, then it can just always use lazy triangulation, and it can even perhaps do a form of self-triangulation as well. But then other people, if they have to tolerate that, will have to invest in their own self-triangulation, which they can perhaps know, as I was trying to say, like, sometimes self-triangulation is a defense mechanism, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be used and believed in at the same time. It can just be essentially a coping mechanism. I must say, I think I'm able to very easily stop the coping mechanism. I'm aware of it, but I'm also aware that it's better to use it than not to use it in my immediate circumstance. Anyway, okay, let me move on back to trust. So the AI in this third episode of Westworld is not able to actually have not able to properly plan, because it's not able to actually use the notion of trust in its plans, which would actually make it incapable of actually doing any kind of real planning. It wouldn't have any insight, and if it didn't have a model of trust, it wouldn't have any insight anyway. And in the in the in the story, it's called insight. Anyway, what's my point here? So this fake insight that has to be commodified as this is interesting, because that is like the identity politics complaint, is that the power system is a fake insight, um, and they don't trust our identity. It's interesting how essentially the reaction, the problem, essentially, like it's just this chain of. I mean, you could, on some level, you could describe it as a chain of self-triangulation. This is how it is. It breeds like a contagion, like a virus. It doesn't. Um, I would say that maybe it is good that it is prolific in the culture, because obviously it was weird. It was beaten back after World War II. I would say after the defeat of the Nazis, it seems that people did were aware of the perniciousness of that form of culture. I mean, it wasn't completely dead. I mean, I think that it is the same. People don't understand. Uh, the Nazis were not a right-wing party. Um, that might be some kind of inane political description, but culturally, they were the so-called progressives of their time. They were the legal positivists. They were, you know, uh, they were actually, their whole political culture revolved around women. In fact, it was the Nazi women who were the leaders in the marches. They were the cultural lifeblood. They were. I mean, when you see these pictures of these male soldiers, you're not looking at the culture of Nazi society. You're looking at its so they didn't send their women out in uniform, but the Aryan woman or whatever were culturally empowered. And in fact, you could say that the whole thing was a fucking matriarchy. I mean, if you uh, the kind of feminine empowerment that they modeled and such. But I mean, politically, they did drive the culture. I mean, it was when you actually hear testimonial about the Nuremberg rallies, for instance, the dissatisfaction marches, as they're called. Um, the women were the cultural ringleaders. There's no denying that. Um, One could argue that culturally that they drove it as well. They made it popular. They dignified it. Um, yeah, there is this connection, I think, and it might have something to do with borderline being more of a feminine thing and being inculcated into the gender role, that they are more resonant with identity politics naturally because they are used to operating as a block. They are used to getting into this cult of womanhood and functioning in this conformity in order to create social constructs and to control culture as a block. They naturally operate in a kind of identity politics, which is traditionally why they were gated away from political influence, because they were seen to have too much cultural influence already, essentially. Um, I mean, I've treated this earlier, but I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that we should go back to these things. We need to actually specifically suppress the bad values, the borderline values, because then we can have everything. We can have proper equality that isn't going to degrade itself and erode itself into an insipid doom spiral that then just has to find a scapegoat in order to continue on this dishonesty, essentially. Um, yeah, I did want to get more onto dishonesty, but I mean, again, like that dishonesty about the self identity is also why it cannot actually plan properly. because it can't even be honest about its own dishonesty, about its own identity, how it's using a chameleon mirage. Which again, someone at some point has to burden the inconsistency and the incoherence of the discrepancies between the procession of the different mirages of identity. Someone has to clean up, someone has to be the janitor of that mess, and that someone has to be some kind of ubiquitous value or power or something like that. And so, ideologically, you can see how that plays out in identity politics. Sorry, I need to go back and attend to things now, rather than just inanely repeating myself. So, what was I talking about? Woman. Trust. I mean, you can see also another replica example of essentially how trust gets gamed if you just, what's it called? I can't remember the name, but Rollo Tomasi, The Rational Male, and when he essentially is going into hypergamous mechanics and tactics, you can see essentially how culture and female strategies for sexual selection have essentially have solidified into a fixed, stable sort of thing. The problem is that you can never satisfy such a woman, because there's this wonderful meme where there's a woman who is awake and she's sitting on the edge of a bed, and the man is asleep behind her. It's a cartoon, and the man has a chiseled jaw, and she's blonde and petite, and she's sort of naked on the edge of the bed, although covered up, so it's not conspicuous in its pornography. And she's looking at the essentially where the camera would be, but obviously it's a cartoon. And on the clothes horse there is a Superman costume. So the joke is that she's just slept with Superman, and then at the bottom of the meme, of the caption, it says, "Is he really the best that I could do?" So it's like she's thinking, is he really the best that I could do? So she's just slept with Superman, and so the idea is like, how can she ever be satisfied? How can she ever have won the game? And this is the problem, is that the game fundamentally doesn't end, it doesn't resolve, it doesn't, because it can't have trust in its own decisions. It can't actually be satisfied ever, because it's taking on the role of this amorphous hypothetical identity that's navigating the world through these heuristics and things like that. And so it doesn't actually make real contact. It makes this conceptual contact with everything. And you can navigate the world that way, but you do need to have, let's say, an arc pervading antagonist, or something that you can blame, at least, or something that will absorb your accountability and absolve you of responsibility. And then you're left not ever actually having confidence ever in any of your decisions. And you can see that the lack of confidence, this is a pervasive social ill at the moment. This is the, let's say, the residue of the toxin of this form of borderline culture and psychology, whatever. This is what is being created in the cultural by having this as our cultural hegemon. What's the word that means like dysphoria, or dysmorphism, or something like that? It means that that you can't identify even with your own body and things like that. I think these might also somewhat be symptomatic of this cultural psychological complex, as it were, as a kind of psychosocial complex. anyway, again, I'm abstracting onto the sociological level. But let me go back and talk about individuals, and trust. Okay, so I'm trying to. I mean, it does interact with culture, and it obviously. So the more individuals, and this is why borderlines generally tend to stick to subcultures, because they can do this shit within their subculture. This is traditionally borderlines would infiltrate into a particular subculture, and they would take it over, because culture used to be policed by responsible people that would suppress these values, that would suppress this bullshit. But as soon as the gatekeepers, as it were, stop becoming gatekeepers and start becoming enablers of the borderline thing, the whole thing just becomes an accelerated shit show. It becomes an accelerated implosion waiting to happen. And so, when essentially we've got corrupt elites, as it were, we've got corrupt gatekeepers, who are themselves part of this ilk of borderline fascistic, legal positivistic, whatever you want to, they're part of this bandwagon essentially. And you have to get rid of them. I mean, that's the only way to do it. You have to have a kind of McCarthy era, Red Scare, essentially. I mean, I'm just talking about something that happened in history. That's the level of revision that you need. You need to reform these systems by identifying the personnel. I mean, obviously there are also fields that are fundamentally toxic. Race and gender studies needs to be completely debunked and be labeled as unconstitutional, for instance. I mean, it's completely racist and disgusting. I mean, it's there to breed fascism, essentially. It's there to breed black national fascism and create the intellectual wrapping and window dressing for this disgusting creed of repurposed Nazi philosophy. I mean, it's utterly antithetical to a liberal, non-racialist constitution. The kind of, I mean, you have to remember, all sociology is an outgrowth of philosophy, and their philosophy is fundamentally devoid. It's fundamentally immoral. It's not even amoral. It's immoral. This is evil shit, and it's propounded by evil people, and they need to be charged with a crime. Really, I mean, constitutional damages. We need a system that is. I mean, we have the most modern constitution in the world, South Africa. We have the most enlightened values, but we don't have defenders. We don't have a public protector. We have a public protector that is impelled by this kind of evil ideology and propounding it. And we have a chief justice which just pollutes the moral atmosphere by giving his disgusting speeches, which, I mean, these are people who, if we have a genocide in this country, they must be at the top of the list for war crimes. These are war criminals in the making. That's what they are. That's the kind of ideological infection that they represent. They have destroyed and betrayed the Constitution. For a Chief Justice to have betrayed the Constitution, you can just see how legal positivism rounds off this, how it blunts that, how it obfuscates that, how it gets around that. Well, he is the Chief Justice. It is his role to interpret the Constitution for the people. You can just see the disgusting authoritarianism built into how the one hand washes the other in this disgusting charade. So we have that going on, and essentially it is concealed by this commodification of trust into convoluting it into a kind of social condition that becomes part of this atmosphere. The government is never accountable as long as its interpretation of its intention falls in line with the descriptive mass that they are using. Everything just gets put into this descriptive mass. Okay. Trust itself becomes such an abused and convoluted concept that even the trust the judiciary is there to fulfill within the role of its ambit. It is essentially becomes a puppet of the plenary. it in fact it tries to create itself as a plenary source. In fact, because the only role that you get one role of leadership, you don't get a division within the state anymore of separation of powers. Instead, you get this: everyone is just a plenary. Everyone is just a moral authoritarian plenary. It's a kind of like a combination between the judiciary and the all leaders, all administrators become this weird kind of conflated parliament unto themselves, unto their own powers, and a judge onto their own things. So you have this combined role as a leader, and that is the proto-Führer concept right there. You get these little field marshals, essentially, in this moral authoritarian game of who will offer paternalism to the identity, who will be the groom of the chameleon identity. Anyway, I'm just showing how essentially when trust is trying to be, and essentially this is what they try to do, they're trying to remove the issue of trust from everything so that it just becomes an intellectual concern, that they don't understand the issue of trust and planning. That those words must be stricken from humanity to some degree and displaced by this ideological apparatus, by these tactics, by the mirage chameleon identity. These things are antithetical to one another. The one substitutes for the other. And so we've got this ideological version of trust, so that people can grandstand in these huge moral authoritarian polemic, sort of things, and that overrides just basic nuts and bolts, individual humanity, just goes by the boards. It just, you can't see people operating. You can't see people operating within their own capacities. That gets overridden by these grand standing narratives that get projected onto them to fulfill this grand vision of this collective identity. So trust is a growing casualty in this scenario. And what's worse as well is that when they actually destroy things, like, let's say, conventions that exist. Now, I will concede that all conventions are fundamentally, let's say, problematic on some level. But as I said, they should be regarded carefully because everything carries some real water. And everything can just be used as a starting point. It doesn't have to be canonical. Nothing, just conventions don't have to be treated as a dogmatic orthodoxy. It just gives you a starting point of where to negotiate or something like that. And, the point of conventions is that perhaps that they are roughly correct, but they should not impel individual behavior. It should only impel things that are morally insignificant. Like, you will use generalizations to know how you should do things that are relatively unimportant. If these things are relatively important, then you shouldn't use generalizations. Or if it's necessary to use generalizations, then you should make the correct caveats, the correct complex, sort of self-restriction or amelioration of that or whatever, and weigh those against alternative courses of action, and alternative procedures and processes. But okay, sorry, let me finish with that one point. What was I saying? Generalizations, trust. Now I've lost that thread. But essentially, it completely collapses the interpersonal dimension of culture and it overrides it with this polemic of these identities and these virtual things, which then everyone is forced to subscribe themselves to, and so it's sort of, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to a large extent. It is interesting that, the idea that, oh well, people have white privilege to sort themselves out, and so let's create a system that presumes that, and therefore you end up somewhat actually making the system have to operate that way to some degree, because you've kind of you've destroyed the notion of good faith, you've destroyed the notion of organic trust, and you've created mandates, and therefore you've created an imposition, quotas or whatever, which then, which when they are actually, because the quotas have to be met, when the quotas are met, it creates these disgusting paradoxes and perverse incentives, and the whole thing fundamentally doesn't work because it's artificial to begin with. And so, it's you've displaced trust. It creates a whole economy of false consciousness, as it were, that corrodes the system and such. Anyway, I'm just going to stop this recording. I'm going on too much, but there was more things to say about trust, even as much as I said.